Imagine a world so empty that the future of humanity hangs by a thread. Around 900,000 years ago, our ancestors may have come terrifyingly close to disappearing forever, reduced to a tiny scattered population struggling through drought, cold, and a changing planet. If just a few more lives had been lost, none of us might be here today. Before we go deeper into this forgotten survival story, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's step back into one of the most dangerous chapters in human history. The wind moves over an empty grassland and finds almost no one. It crosses a world of long drought, sudden cold, shrinking forests, and wide, exposed plains, and in all that space there may be only a few scattered human bands left alive. Not cities, not tribes in the later sense, not anything that history would recognize by name. Just small groups of upright primates carrying stone tools, following water, watching the horizon, and trying not to vanish. Somewhere around 900,000 years ago, if one startling scientific reconstruction is even close to correct, humanity does not stand at the beginning of greatness. Humanity stands at the lip of erasure. The line that will one day lead to every person now living may have narrowed to such an extreme that the breeding population could have been little more than a few thousand individuals, perhaps even fewer in practical terms, spread thin across a dangerous and changing world. For a very long stretch of time, there may have been almost nobody. That possibility changes the emotional scale of prehistory. It is one thing to say that ancient humans lived hard lives. That much is obvious. It is another thing entirely to imagine that the entire future of the human story once depended on a remnant so small, so exposed, and so vulnerable that one more failed season, one more ecological shock, one more cluster of deaths in the wrong place might have ended everything before everything had truly begun. There would be no later migrations into the cold north, no painted caves, no villages, no ships, no writing, no empires, no observatories, no libraries, no satellites, no memory of any kind except what chance embedded in bone and DNA. The species that asks questions about its origin may have survived only because a few ancient people, in a landscape that did not care whether they lived or died, managed to keep going. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what makes this story so powerful is not only the scale of the danger, but the strange way it reaches us. No witness survives, no chronicler records it. There is no monument to the dead because the dead had no stone architecture, and the survivors had no language that leaves inscriptions. The event, if it happened in the way some researchers propose, is known only through clues so indirect that they seem almost unreal patterns in the genes of living people, absences in the fossil record, shifts in climate systems, scattered tool traditions, and the stubborn fact that our lineage appears to have passed through a period of severe constriction. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how exactly to interpret it. But even the debate itself reveals something unsettling. There is a zone deep in the human past where our story nearly goes dark. To understand that darkness, it helps to strip away the comforting illusion that humans were always destined to endure. Looking backward from the modern world makes survival feel inevitable. 7 continents hold billions of people. Humans occupy deserts, forests, coasts, islands, mountain ranges, and frozen margins. They alter rivers, tunnel through rock, fly above oceans, and carry their climate with them in steel boxes and electric grids. It is easy to mistake this enormous present-day abundance for proof of ancient security, but evolution does not work like that. A flourishing species today says nothing about how precarious its earlier chapters may have been. Many successful lineages have disappeared. Many dominant animals have left no descendants. Survival is not a reward for intelligence, effort, or promise. Survival is whatever remains after pressure, luck, timing, and adaptation have all finished their work. Around 900,000 years ago, the human lineage is not yet the one most people picture. There are no modern humans in the strict sense. No Homo sapiens walks the earth. The world belongs instead to earlier human forms, some more widespread than their ancestors, some surprisingly adaptable, some already ranging beyond Africa. Yet broad range can hide fragility. A species may occupy a large territory and still depend on narrow ecological windows within it. It may endure in good times and crumble when those windows shift. What survives in the record suggests that this period sits within a larger age of climatic instability, one in which environments repeatedly reorganize themselves. Lakes expand and vanish. Grasslands spread and retreat. Woodlands fragment. Animal communities move, thin, or collapse. For creatures without agriculture, without storage systems on any significant scale, and without protection from the seasons except what they can build from memory, muscle, and cooperation, such changes are not background scenery. They are fate. Imagine the human world not as a map of settled populations, but as a series of temporary footholds. Water draws life into certain valleys, basins, and corridors. Herd animals make some landscapes worth following and others worthless. Stone suitable for tool-making turns specific outcrops into vital resources. A shift in rainfall can sever one route and open another. A colder cycle can turn a familiar territory into open, hungry ground. One surprising detail of this period is that even modest environmental changes could have enormous demographic consequences when total population numbers were already low by later standards. Ancient human groups were never dense. They lived spread apart, often in small bands that could disappear without leaving much trace, if several regions became unlivable at once, or if pathways between them failed. Whole branches of the human family could vanish almost silently, and silence is one of the most haunting parts of the story. The fossil record does not present prehistory as a neat procession. It stutters, it withholds. It gives a jaw fragment here, a skull cap there, a scatter of butchered bones, a patch of stone tools on an old land surface, then nothing for long stretches. This does not necessarily mean there were no humans in those gaps. Preservation is patchy, discovery is uneven, and entire landscapes that once sustained life may now lie eroded, submerged, buried, or unexplored. Still, there are moments when the absences feel too large to ignore. Population collapse leaves precisely the kind of faint imprint that deep time is most likely to erase. Fewer people mean fewer campsites, fewer dead preserved by rare conditions, fewer tools abandoned in the places archaeologists can reach. A severe bottleneck can look, in the ground, like a thinning of the human presence until it nearly dissolves. The genetic argument, which will matter more later, adds a sharper edge to that impression. Modern human DNA carries signatures of ancient population size, not as a direct census, but as a set of statistical echoes. Researchers studying those echoes have argued that a dramatic collapse took place far back in the Pleistocene, lasting not for a generation or two, but for a staggeringly long interval. In their reconstruction, the ancestors of later humans may have passed through a phase of extreme scarcity, with only a very small effective breeding population sustaining the line. That phrase, effective breeding population, matters because it does not mean the literal head count of every living individual. It reflects how many were actually contributing genetically across generations. Even so, the implications are severe. If the estimate captures something real, then the human line was not merely pressured, it was cornered. Cornered by what is the great question, and one reason the story feels larger than a single scientific paper or a single hypothesis. Climate is an obvious suspect. Around this time, the planet is entering a major transition in the rhythm of ice ages. Glacial cycles appear to lengthen and intensify. Conditions become more extreme, more prolonged, and perhaps more disruptive to the ecosystems early humans depended on. But climate alone may not explain everything. Drought does not kill everyone at once in the same way everywhere. Some regions may have remained habitable. Some groups may have adapted better than others. Some scholars suspect that the real danger lies in clustering environmental stress combined with low population density, slow reproduction, geographic fragmentation, competition with other predators, and the relentless mathematics of small numbers. Once a population shrinks enough, random loss becomes its own threat. A few bad years, a few failed births, a few missing alliances, and decline begins to feed on itself. This is where the story becomes intimate as well as immense. Near extinction is not only a graph or a model. It is a mother with too little food at the wrong time of year. It is children who do not survive a cold stretch. It is a small group forced to move farther for water and arriving too late. It is the loss of elders who remember the route to seasonal resources. It is injury without recovery, separation without reunion, a dry basin where a lake used to be, a herd that no longer returns, a fire that cannot be kept alive, or perhaps has not yet been mastered well enough to transform survival. The daily scale of catastrophe rarely appears in the record, but catastrophe always happens at the daily scale first. Extinction is built from mournings. What makes humans different, even at this deep date, is not invulnerability but dependence. Human beings survive through social bonds more than fang or speed. They learn from one another, copy techniques, share danger, and stretch their physical limits through cooperation. That same strength also creates risk. If groups become too isolated, knowledge can disappear locally. If populations fall below a certain threshold, finding mates becomes harder, exchange networks weaken, and innovation may stall or vanish. The loss is not just numerical, it is cultural, behavioral, and ecological all at once. One lesser-known possibility raised by some researchers is that population crashes may erase entire traditions without leaving a clear trace, meaning some crucial human adaptations could have been invented, lost, and reinvented long before the record stabilizes enough for us to notice. So the mystery opens not with triumph, but with a narrowing. The human story, which later sprawls across continents and ages, may once have been reduced to a few refuges and a few kin lines clinging to landscapes that still offered enough water, food, and stability to matter. They do not know they are preserving a future species. They do not know they stand at the hinge of 1,000,000 years. They know only what the next season requires. They move, watch, gather, cut, carry, perhaps mourn, perhaps remember. Their world is full of animals larger and stronger than they are, full of weather they cannot predict, full of distances that punish mistakes, yet they remain. That is the first and strangest fact. Against conditions that may have erased most of their kind, something in their behavior, their ecology, their luck, or their flexibility allows a remnant to continue. And from that remnant, if the hypothesis holds, comes everything afterward, every kingdom and caravan, every burial and battlefield, every prayer, every machine, every archive, every family name, every language spoken now in crowded streets or whispered in quiet rooms. All of it may descend through a passage so narrow that the loss of a few more lives might have closed it forever. The grandeur of human history often makes survival look like destiny. Deep prehistory suggests something harsher and more humbling. Our presence in the world may rest on one of the most fragile continuities imaginable, an unbroken chain extending back through a time when that chain was almost snapped. The landscape holds no memorial for that moment. There is no marker standing in wind-blown grass saying that here, somewhere in the invisible arithmetic of survival, humanity nearly ended. There is only the puzzle itself, assembled from fragments, models, sediments, climates, and bones. And beneath it lies a deeper discomfort. However advanced the species becomes, however vast its systems grow, it is still the air of a creature that once endured on the thinnest margin. To tell this story properly, it is not enough to say that humans survived. The real story begins with understanding how close they may have come to not surviving at all. Long before the Great Narrowing, before the line of future humanity seems to contract toward a few surviving populations, the human world is already old. It is old in a way that is difficult to feel from the vantage point of modern memory, because nothing from that age carries a familiar name. There are no nations, no epics, no carved dynasties rising beside rivers, yet the human lineage has already been experimenting with survival for an immense span of time. Generations beyond counting have moved through changing African landscapes, and some of their descendants have pushed outward into Eurasia, carrying with them bodies and behaviours that are recognisably human in broad outline, even if they are not yet people anyone today would mistake for themselves. By the time the crisis around 900,000 years ago approaches, humanity is not new. It is seasoned, dispersed, and in some ways unexpectedly successful. That is part of what makes the later collapse so haunting. It does not strike at a lineage that has barely begun. It strikes at one that has already endured, adapted, and spread. The older image of early humans as half-formed creatures stumbling through prehistory has not survived well under evidence. Even the deeper Pleistocene reveals beings that are active, mobile, and capable of inhabiting varied environments. Their tools are simple by later standards, but simple does not mean thoughtless. A shaped stone flake is already a decision preserved in mineral form. It means that someone recognized the qualities of raw material, imagined an edge before it existed, struck with purpose, and understood that useful form could be extracted from resistant matter. Long before advanced symbolic culture becomes visible, there is practical intelligence everywhere in the record. Animals are butchered, bones are broken for marrow, landscapes are revisited, certain places matter enough to return to. These are not passive creatures carried by the environment. They are active participants in it, though still deeply constrained by its violence. Africa remains the central stage of this early human story. The human lineage emerges there, diversifies there, and for a very long time draws its possibilities from a mosaic of habitats that repeatedly shift between woodland, grassland, lake margin, river corridor, and more arid open ground. That mosaic matters. One of the most important and sometimes overlooked features of African prehistory is that it does not unfold in a single stable setting. Early humans are shaped by movement between habitats, by seasonal contrasts, by fluctuating opportunities, and by the need to exploit different resource zones. A hominin that can use both open and patchier environments has an advantage, but that flexibility also means dependence on ecological variety. If the balance between those zones breaks down, a population adapted to a mosaic may suddenly find that the pieces no longer fit together. By this point in prehistory, several human forms may already exist across broad distances, and the exact taxonomy remains debated. Paleoanthropology at this depth is rarely tidy. Fossils are too few, morphology varies, and labels often conceal uncertainty more than they solve it. Still, what survives in the record suggests a world inhabited by descendants of Homo erectus and closely related populations, perhaps alongside regionally distinctive lineages whose relationships remain contested. Homo erectus in particular stands as one of the great survivors of the human family, though even that statement flattens complexity. The name covers a long span of time and a range of bodies distributed across Africa and Eurasia. Some are tall, efficient walkers with proportions well suited for distance travel and heat dissipation. Some carry brains larger than earlier hominins, though still generally smaller than those of later humans. Their faces project more strongly, their skulls are longer and lower, and their skeletons speak of endurance, not elegance. They do not look modern, but they are no longer close to the ape-like origins of the lineage either. They belong to a human middle world, already transformed. Their expansion beyond Africa is one of the defining achievements of early humanity. At some point well before the proposed bottleneck, humans or near-humans have already reached parts of Eurasia. Sites in places such as Dmanisi in Georgia show that very early dispersals out of Africa happened surprisingly long ago. Later populations appear across parts of East Asia, and perhaps Western Europe in scattered and uneven ways. These expansions matter because they reveal not merely wandering, but ecological boldness. To leave the climatic ranges of Africa and move into unfamiliar territories means confronting new predators, different seasonal rhythms, novel foods, and colder conditions. Even with limited technology, early humans are capable of widening their world. They are not trapped by a single niche. That adaptability is real. Yet the evidence also suggests that dispersal did not create dense, secure occupation everywhere. Populations were likely thin, localized, and vulnerable to fragmentation. Expansion can make a lineage look stronger than it is, just as a long branch can look robust until pressure snaps it at its narrowest point. The daily life of these humans is built around motion, attention, and opportunism. They are not farmers shaping the land to fixed plans. They are followers of energy across the landscape. Water sources organize movement. Animal carcasses, whether hunted or scavenged, offer sudden bursts of nutrition. Plant foods matter enormously, though the record often preserves them poorly compared with bone and stone. Tubers, fruits, seeds, leaves, insects, small animals, eggs, and whatever else local environments permit would all have contributed to survival. Diet is not a simple formula. It likely shifts with region and season. And one of the strengths of early humans may have been precisely that they could avoid overdependence on any single food source. Still, flexibility has limits. A species may eat many things and still require a minimum abundance of some reliable calorie base. When environments begin to swing harder and longer between favorable and hostile phases, the diversity that once helped can become harder to maintain. Tool traditions provide another glimpse into the pre-bottleneck world. In many regions, stone industries associated with Acheulean technology begin to appear, marked by large cutting tools such as hand axes and cleavers. These objects are among the most iconic artifacts in human prehistory, partly because they seem to announce a leap in planning and form. A well-made hand axe is not just sharp, It is shaped according to a mental template held through repeated blows, often with notable symmetry. Some scholars caution against reading too much aesthetic intention into that symmetry, and the evidence remains incomplete. But there is no question that these tools reflect a considerable advance in skill and standardization. They also imply something about teaching. Techniques this demanding are unlikely to persist without some degree of social transmission. One individual may discover an effective method, but only a population can preserve it. That preservation, however, is exactly what severe demographic stress can threaten. Looking backward from the later bottleneck, the pre-crisis world appears not simply as a stage of improvement, but as a precarious balance of numbers, knowledge, and ecology. A small and scattered species can carry impressive technical traditions and still remain close to danger. One surprising feature of the early toolmaking is how unevenly it appears across regions. Some places show richer or more distinctive stone traditions, others appear simpler or more intermittent. This does not necessarily mean some populations are more advanced in a straightforward sense. Raw material availability, local needs, preservation bias, and sampling all matter. But it does suggest a human world made up of loosely connected or sometimes disconnected populations, each solving survival under different pressures. That patchiness could become catastrophic under changing climate. If one region fails, there may be no large reservoir of neighboring populations to refill it. The animal world surrounding early humans is formidable. Pleistocene Africa and Eurasia are full of dangerous competitors and prey large enough to injure or kill careless hunters. Big cats, hyenas, crocodiles, bears in some regions, and other large carnivores occupy overlapping territories. Human beings at this stage are not apex predators in any simple sense. They're clever omnivores trying to occupy a contested place within rich but hazardous food webs. Carcasses attract multiple claimants. Waterholes are ambush sites as well as resources. Open country offers visibility but little shelter. Woodland offers cover but also concealment for predators. Children are especially vulnerable. Injury is costly. Infection can be fatal. Every calorie gathered comes with risk. Yet this pressure may also help explain why sociality matters so much. A solitary early human is badly exposed. A coordinated group can watch, defend, share, and remember. Memory is perhaps one of the quiet powers of this older world. Not memory as literature or explicit history, but memory as root knowledge, seasonal timing, danger recognition, and practical inheritance, where water persists longest in the dry season. Which stones fracture well? Which animal trails are worth following? Which trees fruit at the end of a bad period? Which valley becomes deadly when the rains fail? None of this enters the fossil record directly, but all of it may decide whether a group survives. The tragedy of small populations is that this knowledge is vulnerable. Lose too many adults at once, and adaptive memory may disappear faster than genes. A lineage can be biologically alive and culturally poorer in the same instant. There is also the matter of fire, hovering at the edge of certainty. Evidence for the controlled use of fire in the early Pleistocene remains debated, and no single explanation fully accounts for the patchy record. Some sites have been interpreted as signs of burning associated with human activity, while others remain disputed because natural fires can mimic human traces. Even so, the possibility matters. Fire is not just warmth, it changes food, light, protection, and social time. It extends the usable day, hardens wood, deters some predators, and may make harsh environments more manageable. If some human groups have begun to control it, even intermittently, then the pre-bottleneck world may contain pockets of innovation that make certain populations more resilient than others. If not, then the crisis to come unfolds in an even colder and more unforgiving human reality. For all these signs of competence, there is no reason to imagine early humans as steadily climbing towards success in a simple line. Evolution is not a staircase, and the fossil record is crowded with branches that do not lead to the present. Before the bottleneck, the human world is already plural. Different populations experiment with different ecologies, technologies, and dispersals. Some endure locally for long periods, some disappear. Some may leave descendants only indirectly, through lineages we can barely trace. What later becomes humanity is, at this stage, a loose collection of possibilities rather than a single, triumphant species marching forward. That is why the pre-crisis period matters. It shows that expansion and adaptation were real, but not secure. Early humans had achieved enough to spread widely, but not enough to escape the deeper instability of the Pleistocene. Seen this way, the world before the collapse is not a golden age lost to disaster. It is a stretched and tense arrangement, full of ingenuity yet exposed at every seam. Human beings move across continents, but in low numbers. They shape stone expertly, but cannot shape climate. They know landscapes intimately, but those landscapes are beginning to change in rhythms larger than memory. They exploit many food sources, but remain dependent on ecological mosaics that may not endure. They preserve knowledge socially, but their social worlds are fragile and thinly distributed. In good periods, this is enough. In a harder age, it may not be. So before the great narrowing comes the illusion of breadth. Humans exist across a wider world than before. They are capable, watchful, and in some regions surprisingly persistent. Yet beneath that spread lies the old truth that numbers matter. Continuity matters, and environment decides more than ambition ever can. The coming bottleneck will not strike a vast, secure humanity. It will strike this earlier world of scattered skill and exposed resilience, where survival already depends on small groups reading unstable landscapes with absolute precision. The line has extended, it has not thickened, and when the planet begins to turn more hostile, that distinction may prove nearly fatal. The change does not arrive as a single apocalyptic moment. There is no one day when the sky darkens and the old human world ends. Instead, the planet begins to alter its rhythm, and that shift in rhythm may be more dangerous than any brief catastrophe. For countless generations, early humans live through fluctuations they can neither predict nor control. But around this period, the climate system itself seems to deepen, harden, and lengthen its swings. The world enters what scientists call the mid-Pleistocene transition, a drawn-out reorganization of glacial cycles that unfolds roughly between 1.2 million and 700,000 years ago. It sounds technical, almost abstract, until its consequences are imagined on the ground. Ice ages begin to behave differently. Cold periods become longer and more severe. Warm intervals still return, but the pacing of the planet changes. The old environmental pulse that had structured habitats, water systems, and animal movements is no longer the same. For a lineage already living close to subsistence, this is not background noise. It is a slow rearrangement of reality. Earlier in the Pleistocene, the dominant glacial rhythm appears to have been tied more closely to cycles of around 41,000 years. Later, it shifts toward longer 100,000-year cycles, though the exact mechanisms remain debated. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation. Changes in ice sheet dynamics, ocean circulation, carbon feedbacks, and orbital forcing all seem to play roles, and scholars still debate how they interacted. But for human beings on the landscape, the physics behind the shift matters less than its lived result. Cold can now last longer. Dryness can bite deeper. Habitats can stay broken for periods far beyond the memory of a few generations. Seasonal hardship is one thing. A world in which favourable conditions retreat for immense spans is another. A species can adapt to fluctuation more easily than to the prolonged collapse of the settings it depends on. Africa, often imagined as climatically stable compared with the glaciated north, is not spared this instability. The effects there are different, but not gentle. As global systems shift, African rainfall patterns change, monsoons vary, lake basins expand and contract, and the old patchwork of grassland, woodland, and water-rich corridors may become far less reliable. One of the most unsettling features of this period is how ecological richness can vanish not by total desertification everywhere, but by fragmentation. A landscape does not have to become uniformly dead to become hostile. It only has to lose continuity. A lake that once supported game, plant resources, and human movement may shrink or disappear. River systems may become intermittent. Wooded cover may retreat into isolated pockets. Herd animals may alter migration routes or decline locally. The result is a map increasingly full of breaks, with fewer dependable pathways linking one livable zone to another. That fragmentation is deadly to a species like early humanity. These are not animals with stored grain, deep wells, or walls against cold winds. They survive through mobility, ecological memory, and social flexibility. A fragmented world punishes all three. Mobility becomes more dangerous when distances between resources increase. Memory becomes less useful when old patterns no longer hold. Social resilience weakens when groups are cut off from one another for longer stretches. Even if some regions remain productive, the corridors between them may fail, and for sparse populations, corridor failure can be as destructive as local extinction. A human band does not need the whole continent to turn against it. It only needs its seasonal route to break. The mid-Pleistocene transition also changes the wider animal community on which humans depend. Large herbivores are shaped by vegetation, water availability, and the length of productive seasons. As ecosystems reorganize, prey species shift in abundance and distribution. Some flourish in more open conditions, others decline as habitats vanish. Carnivores respond in turn. Human beings sit inside this larger web, never outside it. If prey becomes less predictable, foraging costs rise. If carcasses become rarer, scavenging becomes riskier. If animal communities move through new corridors, humans must either follow or be left behind. One lesser-known implication of major climate transitions is that even when biomass remains high on a continental scale, it may become less accessible locally and seasonally. Plenty somewhere is still starvation here. The physical landscape changes too. Glacial expansion at higher latitudes traps enormous volumes of water in ice, lowering sea levels and redrawing coastlines. Winds strengthen in some regions. Dust flux increases. Ocean circulation patterns may alter the transfer of heat and moisture across vast distances. Even places far from the ice sheets feel the consequences. Deep-time climate does not respect the boundaries humans later draw on maps. A colder North Atlantic can contribute to weakened rainfall systems elsewhere. Changing vegetation feeds back into atmospheric chemistry and regional temperature. The Earth system becomes a network of amplifying pressures, many of them invisible to the creatures living through them. Early humans cannot see orbital cycles or measure carbon. They only know that water holes fail sooner, cold seasons bite harder, and familiar grounds no longer provide what they once did. In Eurasia, these changes may be harsher still. Human populations that had expanded out of Africa into temperate regions face the problem of increasingly severe seasonal stress. Cold-adapted large mammals may thrive in some settings, but human occupation there becomes more difficult without reliable fire, shelter, clothing technology, or dense social networks. Some northern or marginal populations may disappear entirely, leaving only intermittent traces in the record. The fossil and archaeological picture from this span is frustratingly sparse, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives suggests uneven occupation rather than secure continuity. A region inhabited during one phase may fall silent in another. These silences may reflect preservation biases, but they may also reveal something blunt: humans were repeatedly pushed back by conditions they could not yet master. What makes prolonged climatic deterioration so dangerous is that it eats away at reproductive stability as much as at immediate survival. A population does not have to suffer dramatic mass death to decline. It can simply fail to replace itself. Long-distance foraging reduces energy available for childcare. Nutritional stress weakens pregnancy outcomes. Infant mortality rises. Interbirth intervals lengthen if mothers are underfed. Small groups lose members to injury, exposure, predation, or infection, and do not recover quickly enough. Over time, such losses accumulate. A population can appear present in the landscape for centuries while quietly heading downward in demographic terms. This may be especially important for understanding a severe bottleneck. The crash need not be a single collapse. It may be a drawn-out erosion lasting thousands of years, hidden inside apparent continuity. There is also the problem of time itself. Human adaptability often works across generations. A group learns a route, a technique, a seasonal strategy, and passes it on. But the mid-Pleistocene transition seems to create pressure on timescales that can overwhelm local adaptation. A few favourable centuries may be followed by a far longer hostile interval. A refuge that sustained one lineage may fail the next. The ability to move and improvise remains valuable, but improvisation has limits when the overall envelope of productivity shrinks. This is where climate ceases to be a challenge and becomes a trap. Each response solves one immediate problem while exposing another. Move farther for water and you lose contact with neighbouring groups. Follow migrating herds and enter unfamiliar predator territory. Stay near dwindling resources and exhaust them. Spread out and mating networks weaken. Gather together and competition intensifies. Some of the most intriguing evidence for instability comes not from humans directly, but from ancient lakes, marine cores, dust records, and isotopic signals that preserve environmental shift with a precision no fossil camp can match. Lake basins in Africa rise and fall dramatically across the Pleistocene. Sediments record pulses of wetter and drier conditions. Pollen traces reveal changing vegetation. Marine oxygen isotope records capture global ice volume and temperature patterns. To a modern scientist, these are measurements. To early humans, they were lived conditions with no explanatory framework, only consequences. A lake that has existed through the memory of many generations may contract into brackish fragments. A grass-rich zone may become scrub or bare ground. The emotional reality of such change is impossible to recover, but it must have been profound. A landscape is not just a food source, it is familiarity. When its logic breaks, survival becomes guesswork. It is tempting to imagine that intelligence alone should have protected humans from such crises. After all, they are toolmakers, cooperative foragers, flexible omnivores. But intelligence is not immunity. In some ways, a cognitively complex, socially dependent species may be even more vulnerable to fragmentation because so much of its survival rests on learned behaviors and shared information. Break the network, and adaptation becomes local and brittle. One small group may solve a problem brilliantly. Another, only a little farther away, may fail because it lacks the right raw stone, the right seasonal memory, or enough healthy adults. This is one reason scholars remain cautious about neat evolutionary stories. The human line survives not because it always outcompetes the environment, but because some populations in some places find workable solutions at the right times. And there is luck. The factor deep prehistory never advertises plainly but never escapes. A refuge may persist because a spring keeps flowing. A basin may remain productive because topography traps moisture. A tool tradition may survive because a few skilled adults live long enough to pass it on. A group may endure a hard cycle because prey moves through its territory one more season than expected. These are not romantic details. They are the fine mechanics of survival. In a world turning hostile, chance and geography can matter as much as broad evolutionary fitness. Scholars can model climate, population size, and habitat suitability. But no model can fully recover the lived contingency of a species hanging on in scattered pockets. By the later phases of the mid-Pleistocene transition, the human world may already be much thinner than before. The great expansionary confidence implied by earlier dispersals begins to look fragile. Regions once occupied intermittently may no longer support people for long. Africa itself, though still the likely core of long-term survival, may be increasingly divided into ecological islands rather than a broad connected homeland. The climate has not killed humanity outright. It has done something subtler and perhaps more dangerous. It has made the world less forgiving to small mistakes and less generous to sparse populations. It has stretched bad years into bad eras. This is why the proposed bottleneck around 900,000 years ago sits so plausibly within a climatic story, even if climate alone cannot explain everything. The mid-Pleistocene transition creates the kind of prolonged, repeated, structural stress that can drive a lineage toward the edge without leaving a single dramatic scar. It does not need to produce universal devastation. It only needs to keep enough habitats unstable for long enough that human numbers fall. Local groups disappear, exchange fails, and recovery never fully catches up with loss. A species already spread thin across continents begins to discover that breadth is no protection against a planet changing its pulse. So the world grows harsher in 1,000 quiet ways. Water becomes less dependable. Warmth retreats. Green corridors break apart. Prey shifts. Distances increase. The old human footholds remain, but fewer of them hold. What once looked like a broad and resilient presence now begins to resemble a set of vulnerable outposts exposed to a colder, drier, more erratic earth. The coming collapse, if collapse is what it was, does not emerge from nowhere. It is prepared slowly by climate, by ecological fracture, and by the simple cruelty of living near subsistence in a world whose rhythms are no longer the rhythms that shaped you. Humanity does not yet know it is entering one of the most dangerous thresholds in its history. It only knows that the world is becoming harder to read and harder to survive. At some point, the pressure becomes more than background hardship. A species can endure instability for a long time and still cross a threshold beyond which decline begins to feed on itself. This is the heart of the bottleneck idea. Not merely that ancient humans suffered, but that they may have been reduced so drastically that the future of the lineage depended on the survival and reproduction of an exceptionally small number of people over an astonishingly long period. The proposed crash around 900,000 years ago is so severe in some reconstructions that it can feel almost impossible to picture. Modern minds are used to human abundance. Even imagining a prehistoric world with only a few 100,000 humans is difficult. To imagine that the effective breeding population might have fallen toward the low thousands, or perhaps something in that range sustained over generations, is to enter a very different scale of existence. It means that across immense stretches of land, there may have been almost nobody. The phrase effective population size can sound misleadingly clinical, and it needs care. It does not mean that a scientist has counted every individual alive at that time. It is a genetic estimate of how many individuals were contributing genes across generations in a way that would produce the patterns seen later. The actual number of living people could have been higher, perhaps much higher in absolute terms, depending on population structure, sex ratios, variance in reproduction, and the uneven realities of ancient life. Even so, the estimate matters because it points toward a severe restriction in ancestry. A large living population can still behave genetically like a small one if only a limited portion is reproducing consistently, or if groups are deeply fragmented. In practical terms, that means the lineage may have been hanging on through a narrow channel, even if scattered human bands still survived in several places. What would such a crash look like on the ground? Not a single dying crowd, not an obvious end, but a thinning. Campsites become rarer. Familiar routes are abandoned. One valley still holds water, another does not. A band that once met others during seasonal movement no longer encounters them. A child grows up without hearing stories of more distant kin because those kin are gone, or too far away, or separated by terrain that has become impossible. A place used for generations is visited one last time. A tool tradition persists in one pocket but disappears in another. Death comes in ordinary forms: exposure, malnutrition, infection, predation, childbirth, injury. The terrible force of a bottleneck is that ordinary deaths stop being ordinary when there are too few people left to absorb them. Small populations are not simply reduced versions of large ones. They obey different rules. In a large population, a bad season kills some and others replace them. Innovation can spread, mates can still be found. If one local group disappears, neighbouring groups may repopulate the area. In a very small population, every loss changes the structure of survival itself. Lose a skilled toolmaker, and useful knowledge may fade. Lose a woman of childbearing age, and future births fall. Lose a connection between two bands, and mate exchange narrows. Lose a few infants in succession, and the generation gap widens. Demography becomes fragile not because every event is dramatic, but because too many small events point in the same direction. A bottleneck is built from cumulative weakness, from the inability to recover fully before the next blow lands. This fragility would have been intensified by the geography of the human world at the time. Ancient humans were likely dispersed across ecological patches, not packed into continuous populations. If climate stress fragmented those patches further, each surviving group may have become more isolated. Isolation can protect in the short term by reducing competition for local resources, but it carries dangerous costs. Inbreeding risk rises, genetic diversity falls, cultural variation narrows or disappears, social alliances weaken. Most importantly, local extinctions become permanent. If one small band dies out in a fragmented landscape, there may be no neighbouring group close enough to replace it. The map of humanity shrinks not all at once, but piece by piece, as lights go out across the landscape and are not relit. One of the most sobering aspects of this proposed population crash is its duration. Some models suggest not a brief disaster, but a long bottleneck lasting many thousands of years. That length matters because short crises can be survived through stored resilience. A species can bounce back after a volcanic winter, a drought cluster, or a regional ecological shock if broader conditions improve soon enough. A prolonged bottleneck is different. It does not allow for easy recovery. It keeps population numbers low long enough for chance losses, low fertility, local extinctions, and fragmentation to reinforce one another. Even groups that survive the first phase of stress may slowly decline under the weight of repeated hard years. In such a world, survival stops being a matter of endurance alone. It becomes a matter of whether any population can remain just above the minimum needed to keep reproducing across generations. Daily life under these conditions would have been shaped by relentless calculation, though not calculation in any formal sense. Every movement cost energy, every pursuit of prey risks injury, every dry season decision carries the shadow of what comes after. A band cannot afford to linger too long where food is failing, yet leaving too early may mean walking into emptier land. Mothers nursing infants would have faced especially high energy demands. Children, the elderly, the injured, and the sick would all place moral and practical pressure on group decisions. Anthropologists studying later foraging peoples have shown how social care can be central to human survival, but care itself depends on surplus, or at least on not being pushed past the point where one more dependent body threatens the group. The evidence remains incomplete, and no direct window into the emotional life of these ancient people survives. But no single explanation of a bottleneck is sufficient without imagining the burden carried at the scale of family. The environment would have offered no mercy simply because a lineage had become rare. Predators would still patrol water margins, disease would still move through weakened bodies, weather would still turn cold with no regard for how thin the human population had become. This is one of the most difficult truths to keep in view. Near extinction does not arrive with ceremonial drama. The world does not announce that a threshold has been crossed. The grass still moves in the wind. Herds still pass where they can. Rain still fails or falls according to forces beyond local control. Somewhere, perhaps only a few days' walk away, another human band may still exist. Yet if contact is broken, that fact means almost nothing. A species may be alive in the abstract while being absent from almost every horizon any given person can see. And with isolation comes another danger, the erosion of learned strategies. Human beings survive not only with bodies but with transmitted behavior. Knowledge of seasonal foods, water sources, safe routes, predator patterns, stone procurement, shelter choices, and perhaps fire use if it was reliably controlled. All depends on continuity. In a shrinking population, continuity becomes brittle. A few deaths can erase local expertise. One lesser-known point in population biology is that cultural information can disappear faster than genes in small groups, because useful practices often depend on repeated demonstration and social density. An ancient population may remain physically present while becoming behaviorally poorer, less capable of exploiting marginal habitats or recovering from new shocks. This kind of invisible cultural attrition would leave little direct trace, yet it may have been crucial. Reproduction under bottleneck conditions would also be shaped by scarcity in ways that modern abundance can easily obscure. Human offspring are costly. They require extended care, and human mothers are unusually burdened by long dependency periods compared with many other mammals. In poor conditions, fertility often falls and infant mortality rises. If bands are small and mobility demands remain high, the survival of multiple young children at once becomes even harder. There may have been intervals when women delayed reproduction because they had no physiological margin, or when pregnancies failed more often under stress, or when children born alive could not be carried through repeated moves and food shortages. This is not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but it is devastating in demographic terms. A lineage does not need spectacular death to crash. It only needs too few surviving births. The social world of the bottleneck would likely have become tighter and more fragile at the same time. Survivors in a hard landscape may depend on one another more intensely, sharing food, defense, knowledge, and care. Yet this same closeness makes every death more consequential. In a group of 15 or 20, the loss of 2 adults is not a sorrow contained by larger structure. It is structural damage. The loss of 1 experienced forager, 1 strong carrier, 1 woman with deep-root memory, 1 elder who knows how to find water late in the dry season, can change the fate of everyone else. Human cooperation is powerful, but when numbers are very low, it also becomes painfully exposed. Every role matters because there is no redundancy. It is possible, too, that not all populations suffered equally. Some regions may have collapsed rapidly while others functioned as refuges. Some bands may have vanished without descendants, while a few lineages in ecologically favourable zones maintained enough continuity to sustain future recovery. This unevenness is important because it reminds us that bottlenecks are rarely uniform across landscapes. They are shaped by topography, rainfall patterns, prey stability, disease environments, and pure contingency. The human story at this stage may already have been separating into winners and losers in evolutionary terms, though the difference could come down to something as simple as access to a perennial spring or a basin that retained productivity when nearby lands failed. From the perspective of later humanity, these differences become invisible because only the successful line continues. What the bottleneck means, then, is not just fewer humans, it means a transformed human condition. Distance between groups increases, recovery slows, knowledge becomes vulnerable, reproduction weakens, local extinctions accumulate, the lineage persists, but only narrowly, and perhaps without the people living through it realizing how extraordinary that persistence is. They are not preserving the species in any conscious sense. They are only surviving from one season to the next. Yet in evolutionary terms, those seasons are everything. The future of humanity may have depended on the capacity of a handful of scattered populations to remain just intact enough, just fertile enough, just connected enough to avoid slipping below the point of return. And that point of return is worth pausing over. Extinction is often imagined as a dramatic final death, but in reality it usually arrives earlier, when a population becomes too small, too fragmented, or too biologically compromised to sustain long-term continuity. After that, individuals may still be alive for generations, but the line is already broken. If the bottleneck hypothesis is right, ancient humans came dangerously close to that threshold, close enough that the later abundance of humanity should not be read as proof of safety, but as evidence of recovery from something almost fatal. Our species' history may not be the story of a steadily rising population. It may be the story of a lineage that once endured a demographic narrowing so extreme that for a very long time, humanity existed as a sparse and fragile remnant on a hostile planet. The crash, in other words, is not just a number inferred from DNA. It is a world with fewer fires, fewer voices, fewer camps, fewer births, fewer returns. It is a species receding from much of its own range. It is continuity hanging by threads stretched across broken landscapes. To say that humans almost went extinct is not to claim that the Earth nearly became empty of upright primates overnight. It is to say something more unsettling. For thousands of years, perhaps longer than any memory could hold, the future human world may have rested on populations so reduced and so exposed that one more phase of decline might have ended the story before it ever reached us. The strangest part of this story is that no one discovered the bottleneck by digging up a hidden valley full of skeletons. No cave wall records the year humanity nearly disappeared. No ancient witness survives to tell us that the land emptied, that the old roots failed, that children stopped being born often enough. Instead, the clue emerges from the living. It is hidden in the DNA carried by people now scattered across the world, encoded in patterns so small that they require mathematics, computing power, and enormous comparative datasets to make them speak. This is one of the great revolutions in the study of the deep human past. Where earlier generations depended almost entirely on fossils and stone tools, modern researchers can sometimes reconstruct ancient population history from the genetic traces left in the descendants of populations that survived. The method is powerful, but it is not magic. It produces inferences, not direct observation, and that distinction matters everywhere in this debate. At the center of the bottleneck claim is a basic problem in population genetics. If a species passes through a period when only a small number of individuals contribute genes to future generations, that reduction leaves signatures in later genetic diversity. Over long stretches of time, mutation adds new variation, recombination shuffles it, and demographic change alters how that variation is distributed. Large populations tend to preserve more genetic diversity. Small populations lose it more easily through drift. The random rise and fall of gene variants simply because too few breeding individuals exist to buffer chance. In a severe bottleneck, drift becomes much stronger. Some lineages vanish entirely. Others become unusually common not because they're especially beneficial, but because they happen to survive the narrowing. The result is not a neat historical document, but a statistical scar. Modern scientists attempt to read that scar by comparing genomes from living human populations and modelling how their shared ancestry must have behaved in the past to produce the present pattern of variation. In simple terms, they ask how much diversity exists, how it is distributed, how old particular branches appear to be, and what demographic history best explains the shape of the genetic tree. The challenge is that no single genome carries a full history in obvious form. Human ancestry is layered, recombined, and full of noise. Population sizes change, groups split and mix. Natural selection affects some regions of the genome. Mutation rates must be estimated. Assumptions built into the models matter enormously. So the bottleneck claim is not the result of one glowing signal pointing backward to a precise prehistoric event. It is the result of sophisticated attempts to infer a likely demographic past from many noisy pieces. One of the more widely discussed recent efforts used a method designed to reconstruct ancient population size changes by analysing the distribution of genetic lineages through time. The researchers argued that the ancestors of modern humans may have undergone a severe bottleneck beginning around 930,000 years ago and lasting for well over 100,000 years. In their reconstruction, the effective breeding population dropped dramatically, to a level so low that it immediately attracted attention far beyond specialist genetics. Newspapers seized on the phrase that humans nearly went extinct. The dramatic language was understandable, but it also risked oversimplification. What the study proposed was not that only a literal handful of human beings remained alive on Earth, nor that the case was closed. It proposed that the lineage leading to modern humans passed through an extended period of very low effective population size, severe enough to suggest an extraordinary demographic crisis. To appreciate why this claim matters, it helps to understand that genetic diversity in modern humans is already somewhat unusual. Compared with many other large, widespread animal species, humans have relatively low genetic diversity. That has long suggested some kind of constriction, or series of constrictions in our past. More recent demographic events, especially those associated with the expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa and later regional founder effects, certainly play a role. But some researchers have argued that part of the explanation lies much deeper in time. If a major bottleneck occurred nearly 1 million years ago, it could help explain why later humanity carries a narrower range of inherited variation than sheer population size today might lead one to expect. In that sense, the bottleneck is not just a prehistoric curiosity. It may still live inside every genome. The methods used to detect such deep events are impressively technical, but their logic can be described without drowning in equations. Imagine tracing the branches of many family trees backward, not for one family or one village, but for humanity as a whole. As those lines converge deeper in time, the rate at which they merge tells scientists something about ancestral population size. If there were many breeding individuals, lineages tend to take longer to merge because there are more ancestral branches available. If there were very few, lineages merge more quickly because they are forced through a narrow ancestral bottleneck. By examining patterns across many regions of the genome, researchers can estimate periods when the ancestral population must have been smaller or larger. It is a little like listening to the echo in a canyon and trying to infer the width of the walls. The signal is indirect, but it carries information. Yet indirect information always comes with uncertainty. Mutation rates are not perfectly known. Generation times are estimated. Natural selection can distort patterns that might otherwise be read as neutral demographic history. Population structure complicates everything. This is a crucial point. A species divided into many semi-isolated subpopulations can sometimes produce genetic patterns that resemble a bottleneck, even if the total number of living individuals was not as low as the models suggest. In other words, fragmentation can look like collapse from the perspective of shared ancestry. That does not make the signal meaningless, but it does mean that genetic evidence must be interpreted with caution. Scholars still debate whether the proposed bottleneck reflects an absolute crash, extreme subdivision, or some combination of both. Another challenge lies in the fact that genetic methods are strongest when multiple lines of evidence converge. A model may suggest a demographic collapse, but if fossils, archaeology, climate records, and comparative genomics do not align well, confidence has to remain limited. In this case, part of the interest comes from the fact that the proposed bottleneck falls within a period of significant climatic upheaval and within a stretch of the human fossil record that appears sparse and patchy in some regions. That does not prove the case, but it makes it more plausible than if the genetic signal pointed to a time of ecological stability and abundant human remains. What survives in the record suggests stress, discontinuity, and low visibility. The genetic model offers a possible demographic explanation for why. There is also an unexpectedly subtle aspect to these analyses. They do not only estimate population size, they can sometimes hint at periods when evolutionary change accelerated because a bottleneck reshaped which lineages remained. In a very small population, drift can magnify certain variants quickly, and novel mutations arising after the bottleneck may spread through a recovering lineage more effectively. Some researchers have even speculated that such deep demographic constrictions may be linked to major turning points in the human lineage, including the emergence of later ancestral groups. That remains much more uncertain than the bottleneck signal itself, and no single explanation fully accounts for the larger evolutionary picture. Still, the possibility is fascinating. A near extinction does not merely remove variation, it can alter the direction of what comes next. One of the surprising strengths of genetic evidence is that it can preserve traces of events far older than the oldest written history by orders of magnitude. A genome is not a diary, but it is an inheritance record. Every person alive carries an archive assembled from countless ancestors, with older layers compressed beneath newer ones. Most of that archive is unreadable without statistical tools, and much of it is lost to time. But enough remains that ancient demographic shock can still leave detectable impressions. This gives population genetics a special role in deep prehistory. Fossils tell us who existed in certain places when conditions preserved them. Tools tell us what behaviors were possible. Climate proxies tell us what environments did. Genetics can sometimes reveal whether the invisible population behind those traces was broad and resilient or thin and endangered. Still, the evidence remains incomplete, and perhaps the most responsible way to describe the genetic case is as a strong hypothesis rather than a final verdict. The models are only as good as their assumptions and data. Ancient DNA from this time period is effectively out of reach in most cases, especially from Africa where warm climates are hostile to long-term preservation. That means scientists are reconstructing very old demographic events without the direct temporal anchors that have transformed later periods of human evolution. For the bottleneck around 900,000 years ago, there is no ancient genome to compare against the model directly. Everything must be inferred backward from modern diversity and from our broader understanding of how populations behave. That is powerful, but it is also an invitation to humility. The public response to the bottleneck claim is often focused on the most dramatic interpretation, as though researchers had discovered that humanity shrank to a tiny tribe on the edge of total disappearance. The reality is subtler and, in some ways, more interesting. The genetic evidence does not show a movie. It shows distortion in the ancestry pool. It reveals that the later human lineage may have passed through a narrow and prolonged demographic filter. That filter could reflect severe population decline, deep fragmentation, repeated local extinctions, or some combination of all three. What it does not tell us on its own is exactly where the survivors lived, what species name should be attached to them, how they organized their lives, or which immediate pressures pushed them into that narrowing. For those answers, genetics has to meet archaeology, climate science, paleoanthropology, and a great deal of disciplined imagination. Even so, the genetic signal matters because it changes the question from idle speculation to structured investigation. Without it, the idea of a near extinction nearly 1 million years ago might sound like a dramatic story in search of evidence. With it, scientists are forced to ask whether a major demographic crisis really did occur, what caused it, and how it fits into everything else known about the Middle Pleistocene human world. It gives shape to the silence in the record. It suggests that the sparseness of fossils and the intensity of environmental change may not be unrelated accidents, but reflections of a lineage under severe pressure. So the bottleneck enters science not as a skull in the earth, but as a pattern in living inheritance, a deep mathematical whisper carried inside modern human DNA. It is an extraordinary example of how the most ancient human dramas can remain present in bodies that know nothing of them consciously. We do not remember the crisis. We do not inherit stories from it. But if the models are even roughly right, we inherit its consequences. Every genome becomes a distant echo chamber, and somewhere inside that echo is the suggestion that our species' history passed through a phase when the line of ancestry grew dangerously thin. The claim is bold, the methods are complex, and the debates are far from over, but the possibility they reveal is difficult to ignore. Humanity may have left one of its deepest traces not in monuments, but in the reduced diversity of the descendants who happen to survive. If genetics provides the whisper, archaeology provides the silence around it. The Earth does not offer a clean human census for 900,000 years ago. It offers fragments, a skull fragment weathering from sediment, a handful of shaped stones on an ancient surface, cut marks on animal bone, traces of occupation so light they almost seem accidental. Then, between such traces, there are gaps. Some are ordinary. The fossil record is famously incomplete, and early human remains are rare under the best of circumstances. Most bodies vanish without a trace. Most camps leave almost nothing. Whole landscapes that once held life have been eroded away, buried under younger deposits, drowned, or simply never searched closely enough. Yet even after allowing for all of that, there are stretches in the Middle Pleistocene record where the human presence can feel unnervingly thin. It is in those stretches that the bottleneck idea begins to find material company. The key point is not that the archaeological record proves a population crash by itself. It does not. Bones and stones cannot give a global count, and absence is never straightforward evidence of disappearance. But the record does show something consistent with demographic fragility patchiness, regional interruption, and long intervals where the human signal appears faint compared with what later periods will produce. What survives in the record suggests a world in which humans are present, but often sparsely so, and sometimes hard to find at all. For a lineage supposedly spread across Africa and parts of Eurasia, that scarcity is striking. It may reflect bias in preservation and discovery. It may also reflect the deeper reality that the populations themselves were small, localized, and frequently lost. Fossils from this time are especially difficult because species boundaries are blurred and specimens are few. Paleoanthropologists can spend decades arguing over a jaw, a brow ridge, or a few teeth, not because the discipline is uncertain by habit, but because the material is genuinely limited. Around the span bracketing 900,000 years ago, the human fossil record includes notable finds, but not a dense sequence. There are remains attributed to Homo erectus in Africa and Asia, material from Western Eurasia that some connect to later European lineages, and scattered specimens whose classification remains unsettled. Yet when placed on a timeline, the picture often looks more like isolated islands than a continuous shoreline. There are populations here and there, some persisting, some perhaps replaced, some impossible to link securely. If a severe bottleneck or broad fragmentation occurred, this is roughly the kind of fossil landscape one might expect, not total emptiness, but a scattering. One of the more haunting features of deep prehistory is that extinction and invisibility can look almost identical. A local human population may vanish and leave no sign except the absence of later finds. Another may persist in low numbers for tens of thousands of years and still leave only a few isolated traces. Archaeologists are forced to work between these extremes. A region that appears silent may once have supported small groups living lightly on the land. A region with a few spectacular fossils may represent only a thin and temporary occupation. This is why the archaeological record, though suggestive, cannot simply confirm the genetic bottleneck. It can only be read in terms of patterns. How dense are the traces? How continuous are they? How broadly distributed? And how do they compare with changing climate and habitat conditions? Stone tools are often more informative than bones, simply because they survive better. A hominin body decays quickly unless rare conditions intervene. A stone edge can outlast continents' worth of weather if it becomes buried in the right place. But tools have their own ambiguity. A scatter of flakes may indicate a brief butchery event, a repeated resource processing station, or even natural breakage if the context is poor. More formal tool traditions, especially Acheulean assemblages with hand axes and cleavers, offer stronger evidence of sustained behavior and skill, but even these do not reveal how many people made them or how continuously a region was occupied. A beautifully shaped hand axe can survive from a population that was already demographically fragile. In that sense, technology may outlast the density that once supported it. Still, the record of stone industries around this period tells an important story. In parts of Africa and Eurasia, Acheulean technology appears with impressive persistence, suggesting that some populations maintained stable traditions across long spans. This is evidence against any crude image of total human collapse everywhere. If hand axe making traditions continue, then at least some groups remained viable enough to preserve learned skill. Yet the distribution is uneven. Some regions show richer Acheulean signatures than others. Some sequences are intermittent. Some places preserve simpler or more expedient toolkits alongside or instead of the classic large cutting tools. Scholars still debate how much of this reflects functional differences, raw material constraints, preservation bias, or real population discontinuity, but it does imply a human world that is regionally variable and perhaps only loosely connected. In such a world, a bottleneck need not erase all cultural traditions. It only needs to reduce the overall network to a much smaller and more fragile set of surviving populations. Africa is especially important here because it is the most likely long-term refuge for the lineage leading to later humans. Yet the African Middle Pleistocene record is full of both promise and frustration. There are major sites with rich faunal and lithic evidence, basin systems that clearly supported repeated occupation, and hints of evolving human behavior. But there are also long gaps, poor preservation in many key habitats, and the constant problem that tropical and subtropical environments are not always kind to bones. Open-air sites dominate much of the earlier record, and these are vulnerable to erosion and disturbance. Caves, which preserve later prehistory so well in some regions, are not always the main repositories for this deeper time span. The result is that Africa likely held far more human history than the current record displays. That missing history makes it harder to say whether an apparent thinning reflects true demographic crisis or simply the bad luck of preservation. Yet the silence itself remains suggestive because it aligns with a period when climate records independently point towards severe instability. Outside Africa, the picture is no less complicated. In Western Eurasia, sites associated with early humans appear and disappear across the Middle Pleistocene, sometimes hinting at repeated expansions and retreats. Occupation at higher latitudes may have been episodic, tracking warmer intervals and collapsing under harsher conditions. A region can yield remarkable evidence of human presence during one climatic phase and fall nearly silent in another. This is exactly what one might expect if early populations were vulnerable to repeated local extinctions. Even where human beings had shown they could disperse widely, continuity was not guaranteed. The archaeological record in Eurasia may therefore preserve not a steady frontier of human advance, but a restless map of occupation pulses, failed footholds, and returning absences. One lesser-known but important clue comes from faunal associations. At many early sites, the animal communities found with human tools tell us what sort of environment people were inhabiting and what opportunities or pressures they faced. Shifts in associated fauna can reflect broader habitat change, open country grazers replacing woodland-adapted species, more arid assemblages appearing where wetter conditions once prevailed, or cold-adapted species moving into areas that earlier supported different ecosystems. Humans do not appear in isolation at these sites. They are embedded in changing ecological communities. Where the faunal record shows major turnover, the human record often becomes unstable too. This does not prove causation in a simple way, but it strengthens the broader impression that the human signal was riding on ecosystems under stress. There is also the question of fire, which remains one of the most contested issues in interpreting the archaeology of this period. Some sites preserve traces that may indicate controlled use of fire, but the evidence is frequently disputed. Burned sediments or bones can result from natural wildfire, later disturbance or human management, and distinguishing between these is difficult in very old contexts. If some populations had reliable fire control by or around this time, that would have major implications for survival in marginal environments, food processing, predator defense, and social organization. If they did not, then their vulnerability under deteriorating climatic conditions was even greater than it already seems. The archaeological silence around fire is especially frustrating because it may conceal one of the very adaptations that helped some groups survive while others disappeared. What archaeology captures more reliably than any single innovation is scale, and the scale often appears small. Even important early human sites can represent brief visits, repeated but low-intensity occupations, or narrow windows of use. There is rarely the sense of dense, saturating human presence that characterizes much later periods. That matters because the bottleneck hypothesis does not require dramatic ruins of collapse. It fits a world where human beings were already spread thin, where losing some regions would produce only faint changes in the material record, and where local disappearance could occur almost silently. A species with low population density leaves behind exactly the kind of patchy archive that makes a demographic crisis difficult to prove and difficult to dismiss. The fossil record also raises another possibility: lineage turnover. Around this broad span of time, some researchers have suggested that the sparse and shifting human record may reflect not merely low population size, but evolutionary transition. Populations associated with earlier forms may have dwindled or disappeared in some areas, while later ancestral groups emerged or expanded elsewhere. If true, the bottleneck could be entangled with speciation processes, replacement events, or the restructuring of the human family tree. This remains highly uncertain. Species labels in the Middle Pleistocene are contested, and no single explanation fully accounts for the patchwork of remains. But it means that the archaeological gaps may represent more than demographic thinning. They may be places where entire human branches ended while one narrow branch continued. Silence, then, becomes evidence only when handled carefully. Archaeologists know too well the danger of treating missing finds as missing people. Yet they also know that prolonged and repeated sparseness across multiple lines of record can mean something real. In this case, the silence is not empty. It is bordered by climate instability, scattered fossils, intermittent occupation, contested fire use, variable tool traditions, and a genetic model that points toward deep demographic stress. None of these proves the bottleneck alone. Together, They create a landscape in which such a bottleneck becomes imaginable in grounded terms rather than as mere drama, and perhaps that is the most honest conclusion archaeology allows. The Earth does not hand us a clean narrative saying that humanity nearly vanished. It gives us something more unsettling: too few bones, too many gaps, too many local histories ending without explanation, and just enough tools to know that humans were there, thinking, cutting, carrying, surviving for a while, then sometimes disappearing from view. The stones endure better than the people who shaped them. The bones endure only by accident. Between them stretches a silence that may reflect the ordinary incompleteness of deep time, or may preserve the shadow of one of the worst demographic crises our lineage ever faced. Archaeology cannot solve that silence completely, but it can show that the world genetics describes was not implausible. It was a real human world of scattered camps, unstable footholds, and traces thin enough that, if numbers truly collapsed, the ground would remember it only faintly. The deeper this story goes, the harder it becomes to answer a question that sounds simple on the surface. If humans nearly vanished around 900,000 years ago, which humans were they? The temptation is to attach the event neatly to a familiar label, to say that this was Homo erectus, or the ancestor of Homo sapiens, or some transitional species standing exactly where later humanity begins. But the Middle Pleistocene does not organize itself that cleanly. The names are modern scaffolding built around incomplete fossils, regional variation, and a family tree that still refuses to settle into a single, uncontested shape. Around this time, the human lineage is not one obvious species marching under a clear banner. It is a loose and shifting population complex spread across continents, with branches that may connect, diverge, disappear, or merge in ways the evidence can only partly recover. That uncertainty matters because the bottleneck is a demographic event inferred from the ancestry of living humans. It does not automatically map onto every human population alive at the time. Some groups may have existed and later vanished without contributing to modern people. Others may have been part of the surviving lineage but left few fossils. So when scientists talk about the ancestors of humanity passing through a severe restriction, they are not necessarily describing all hominins on Earth in that moment. They are describing the particular ancestral stream that continues into the present. This is an important distinction. A world can contain multiple human branches at once, and one can crash or continue without the others doing the same. In that sense, the bottleneck is not just about human survival in general, it is about which human line survived. Homo erectus is the obvious candidate whenever this period comes into view, partly because the name covers such a vast stretch of time and geography. In many traditional accounts, Homo erectus is the great durable wanderer of prehistory, emerging in Africa, spreading into Eurasia, and persisting far longer than earlier human forms. The fossils grouped under that name often show a recognizably coherent pattern: long, low skulls, pronounced brow ridges, relatively large bodies compared with earlier hominins, and limb proportions suited for efficient walking over distance. These are humans of endurance and expansion. They seem built for movement across open country, for exploiting dispersed resources, and for living in a range of settings broader than that of their predecessors. If any human species appears likely to have been present around the bottleneck and capable of surviving through enormous environmental instability, Homo erectus seems a strong possibility. Yet Homo erectus is also a taxonomic container that may hold too much. The fossils called erectus span hundreds of thousands of years and vast regions from Africa to East Asia. Not all paleoanthropologists agree that these populations should be grouped so broadly. Some distinguish African forms from Asian ones more strongly. Some use other names for particular subsets or later descendants. Some argue that what is often treated as one sprawling species may have included several lineages with only partial continuity. These disagreements are not academic hair-splitting. They shape how the bottleneck is imagined. If the human world was already split into several lineages by 900,000 years ago, then the demographic crash may have struck one branch more severely than another, or the surviving ancestry of modern humans may represent only one surviving thread among several contemporaries. Africa remains central because the lineage leading to Homo sapiens is generally thought to have deep roots there, even if its exact relationship to contemporaneous Eurasian populations remains debated. Some researchers have proposed that the bottleneck may have affected ancestral African populations that later gave rise to forms sometimes called Homo heidelbergensis, Homo rhodesiensis, or other broadly Middle Pleistocene humans, depending on which terminology one accepts. The problem is that these labels often overlap, shift in meaning, or conceal deep disagreement. Homo heidelbergensis, for example, has been used at times as a catch-all for large-brained Middle Pleistocene humans in Africa and Eurasia. But many scholars are unhappy with how broad and vague the category has become. Some reserve it more narrowly for European material, others avoid it altogether. If the bottleneck coincides with the emergence of some later ancestral population, then naming the survivors becomes even more difficult because we may be looking at a transition, not a settled species. This is where the fossil record becomes both tantalizing and maddening. Around the broad period bracketing 900,000 years ago, there are human remains from different regions that hint at shifting evolutionary patterns, but they do not line up into a simple sequence. In Western Eurasia, fossils such as those from Atapuerca in Spain have been interpreted in various ways, sometimes linked to Homo antecessor or to lineages ancestral to later European humans. In Africa, the record includes specimens that are important but sparse, leaving long intervals poorly resolved. In Asia, Homo erectus-like populations appear to have persisted for long periods, perhaps with regional continuity that may or may not connect closely to the lineage of later modern humans. Scholars still debate how these populations relate to one another. The result is that the bottleneck falls into a section of the human story where ancestry becomes more like braided channels than a single river. One possibility is that the bottleneck marks a narrowing within African populations that later become the source of subsequent human evolution, while other hominins outside that ancestry continue separately for a time. In this scenario, the crash would not necessarily imply that all Homo erectus populations everywhere were reduced to near extinction in the same way. Asian populations, for example, might have persisted regionally without contributing much or at all to modern human ancestry. The lineage that survives into us would then be only one part of the wider human world. This would help reconcile a severe genetic bottleneck in our ancestry with the fact that hominin occupation in some parts of Eurasia may have continued. It also reminds us that extinction can be selective. Many human populations may remain alive while the future of only one particular line hangs by a thread. Another possibility is more radical and more difficult to prove, that the bottleneck itself helped create a new phase in human evolution. In a very small, isolated population, genetic drift becomes stronger, selection may operate differently, and developmental or behavioral innovations arising after the crash can spread through the recovering lineage. Some researchers have speculated that demographic constriction around this time may be linked to major turning points in the appearance of later ancestral humans. There have even been proposals connecting deep bottlenecks to chromosomal changes in human ancestry. Though such claims are highly speculative and remain far from settled, The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the transition from earlier Homo populations to the forms that later produced Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans. Still, the notion that crisis may have reshaped not just population size, but the structure of the human family is difficult to dismiss entirely. The case of Homo antecessor illustrates the problem well. Known mainly from Spain and still controversial in its exact status, this population has at times been portrayed as close to the common ancestry of later European and perhaps even African humans. Other scholars disagree, seeing it as a side branch or a regional form whose significance has been overstated. If populations like this flourished in parts of Eurasia near the time of the proposed bottleneck, then the human family was already more complex than a single surviving species. Some branches may have expanded during favourable climatic windows, only to contract or disappear later. Others may have remained in Africa, thinly distributed but evolutionarily central. The bottleneck, in that case, would not be a global human blackout. It would be the severe narrowing of the particular ancestral web that leads to later humanity. What survives in the record also suggests that body form and behaviour may not align neatly with ancestry. Two populations can look broadly similar in skeletal terms and yet contribute differently to later lineages. Conversely, a lineage of major importance may leave only sparse or fragmentary fossils, making it seem less central than it really was. This is one reason genetics has transformed the study of later periods so dramatically. Ancient DNA has shown, in the last few decades, that human history is full of lineages once unknown from bones alone. But for 900,000 years ago, ancient DNA is effectively unavailable. We're thrown back onto morphology, chronology, geography, and careful inference. The names we use are therefore less like fixed boxes and more like provisional maps drawn over a landscape still partly hidden by fog. There is, however, one strong conclusion that seems increasingly plausible. Whoever these humans were, they were not primitive in the old dismissive sense. They belonged to a lineage already capable of broad ecological reach, repeated dispersal, sustained tool-making traditions, and social behaviours complex enough to preserve survival knowledge across generations. The bottleneck did not happen to a barely human creature standing at the threshold of personhood. It happened to humans already deep inside the experiment of being human. They were not us, and they may not even fit comfortably under one agreed species name, but they were our kind in the larger evolutionary sense, beings dependent on cooperation, learned skill, and ecological judgment in a fluctuating world. This makes the question of identity emotionally sharper. The survivors of the bottleneck are not generic ancestors. They are members of a contested and partly invisible population phase from which later humanity emerges. They may include late African Homo erectus, or a derivative population on the way toward later Middle Pleistocene humans, or several structured groups exchanging genes imperfectly across a fragmented landscape. Scholars still debate which framework best fits the evidence, but all of those possibilities carry the same basic implication. Modern humans do not descend from an uninterrupted and obvious dominant species striding confidently across the Pleistocene. They descend from a branch that may once have been obscure, scattered, and only one among several human possibilities. There is a humbling quality to that realization. In the deep past, survival does not automatically belong to the most widespread-looking or most familiar-looking population. It belongs to the line that remains fertile, connected, and ecologically lucky enough to continue. Some human groups around 900,000 years ago may have seemed locally successful, occupying good territory, maintaining tool traditions, perhaps even thriving for generations. Yet if they left no descendants, they become evolutionary silence. Others may have been smaller, less visible, more isolated, and still become the source of everything later. The family tree of humanity is therefore not just a story of achievement, it is a story of uneven inheritance, where many branches existed, but only one narrow cluster of them gave rise to the living world. So the question, who are these humans, does not end with a single taxonomic answer. It opens outward into a larger truth about the Middle Pleistocene. Humanity at that time is plural, disputed, and only partly visible. Species names help us think, but they do not eliminate the mist. The bottleneck sits inside that mist, attached not to certainty but to ancestry. The most accurate answer may be the least satisfying in ordinary terms. These were the early humans whose line did not break. They may have resembled Homo erectus in many respects, or belonged to populations emerging from that grade into something new. They may have lived mostly in Africa while related humans endured elsewhere. They may have carried traits that later became central to the human story, or simply happened to be the last surviving branch when others failed. What matters most is that they were few. They were vulnerable, and from among the several human kinds that once shared the planet, their continuity became ours. That continuity, however, was not guaranteed by any name. Taxonomy comes later. Survival came first. Long before scientists argued over species labels, these ancient humans were living through drought, cold, fragmentation, and all the hard arithmetic of a small population under pressure. Their fossils are too scattered to settle every debate, and their exact place on the family tree remains contested. But the record suggests enough to say this with confidence: the near extinction did not threaten some abstract pre-human stage. It threatened real human populations, already shaped by migration, memory, tools, and cooperation. The mystery is not whether they count as human. The mystery is how a lineage so thinly represented in the ground, and so difficult to name with precision, managed to become the sole surviving foundation of everything that followed. Once the possibility of the bottleneck is accepted, even tentatively, the next question becomes unavoidable. What actually drove so many humans toward disappearance climate is the largest answer, and also the least sufficient on its own. A colder, drier, more unstable world can explain why survival became harder, why habitats fragmented, why prey patterns shifted, and why small populations might have been pushed to the edge. But climate is not a single blow. It is a pressure that works through many smaller mechanisms, and those mechanisms are where extinction usually does its real work. No single explanation fully accounts for this crisis. What emerges instead is a cluster of dangers, each destructive on its own, and far worse in combination. The most obvious threat is ecological collapse at the human scale. Early humans do not need the entire planet to become barren for their numbers to crash. They only need the places that matter to become unreliable: a shrinking lake, a broken migration route, the disappearance of edible plant zones during a key season, or the loss of tree cover that once sheltered game and people alike can all have consequences far beyond what a climate graph suggests. A species living on narrow energetic margins is damaged not only by dramatic events, but by repeated disruptions to predictability. If the annual logic of a landscape stops working, then mobility becomes guesswork, and guesswork is expensive. Every wrong move burns calories that are difficult to recover. Food stress may therefore have been the central daily engine of decline. In rich years, humans can absorb mistakes. In poor years, even a small mismatch between energy spent and energy gained becomes dangerous. Hunting large animals is costly and uncertain. Scavenging depends on timing and luck. Plant foods vary by season and climate, and some become scarce exactly when they are most needed. Tubers may remain as fallback foods in some habitats, but digging for them costs labour and water. Insects, eggs, small animals, and gathered plant resources can keep a group alive, yet they may not sustain healthy reproduction over the long term if larger, more calorie-dense resources become too unpredictable. A lineage can survive hunger for a time. It cannot build demographic recovery on hunger. Drought likely played a major role, especially across parts of Africa where water distribution structured everything from herbivore movement to human travel corridors. Drought is not simply a lack of rain. It is the collapse of timing. Water arrives too late, vanishes too early, or falls in ways that no longer sustain the vegetation patterns people rely on. One lesser-known effect of prolonged drought is that it compresses life into fewer remaining wet places, intensifying competition and danger there. Humans, prey, animals, and predators all converge on the same shrinking resources. Waterholes become crowded, overused, and risky. Disease can spread more easily. Conflict with carnivores grows. A population already weakened by food stress may then face higher mortality precisely in the places meant to preserve it. Cold stress, especially outside the warmest refuges, adds another layer. Even modest drops in average temperature can transform survival when people lack tailored clothing, permanent shelter, or reliable fire use. Cold raises baseline energy needs. It increases infant vulnerability. It shortens growing seasons for plant foods and changes where animals can thrive. In Eurasia, harsher winters may have made large parts of the landscape intermittently uninhabitable for early human groups. In Africa, colder global conditions could still alter rainfall, vegetation, and local seasonality enough to destabilize human occupation. The damage of cold is not only freezing death, it is chronic metabolic strain in bodies already short on calories. Then there is fragmentation, one of the most dangerous effects because it works quietly. A species can be numerous in total and still function as a demographic weakling if it is split into small, semi-isolated pockets. Fragmentation breaks mate exchange, slows the spread of useful knowledge, and makes local extinctions permanent. It also amplifies randomness. A group of 20 people in a good refuge may survive many bad seasons, but if that refuge fails or if disease removes several adults, the group can disappear with no replacement. Fragmentation turns survival into a lottery held separately in each patch of habitable land. Some tickets win for a while, most do not. Disease is another possibility, though one that remains largely invisible at this depth. Ancient pathogens almost never leave clear signatures in the record from so long ago, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet it would be naive to imagine that disease played no part in early human demography. Small populations are sometimes thought of as protected from epidemic dynamics, and in some cases they are. But dispersed groups under nutritional stress can also be exceptionally vulnerable to infections that in healthier times might be survived. Water concentration during drought can worsen pathogen exposure. Contact with animal carcasses, parasite loads, and environmental contamination all matter. Disease may not need to sweep through continents to shape a bottleneck. It only needs to raise mortality or reduce fertility repeatedly in populations already living close to failure. Low birth rates may have been just as destructive as high death rates. In demographic terms, a species can slide toward extinction without scenes of mass mortality if women have too few surviving children over long periods. Human reproduction is slow compared with many mammals. Children require years of care. Mothers under nutritional strain have lower fertility and higher risk of unsuccessful pregnancies. Long-distance mobility makes caring for multiple dependent young difficult. If food scarcity, cold stress, and social instability lengthened the spacing between births, then population recovery would have slowed dramatically. In a fragmented world, slow reproduction can be fatal because there is no large population reservoir to compensate for local losses. A few generations of poor replacement are enough to turn difficulty into collapse. Predation and competition with other carnivores likely intensified these pressures rather than driving them alone. Humans at this stage were resourceful, but they were still physically vulnerable animals operating in landscapes full of stronger predators: lions, hyenas, leopards, crocodiles, and regionally other dangerous competitors would all have affected access to carcasses, water, and resting places. A group weakened by drought or hunger is less able to defend a kill, less able to risk nighttime exposure, and less able to recover from injury. An injured adult in a small band is not just an individual setback, it is a reduction in transport capacity, defense, knowledge, and future reproductive support. Predation, therefore, matters not only for the deaths it causes, but for the way it raises the cost of living in already degraded environments. Some researchers also consider the possibility of disaster clustering rather than one dominant cause. This may be the most realistic framework. Climate deterioration weakens ecosystems. Drought compresses populations around water. Nutritional stress lowers fertility and resilience. Fragmentation isolates bands. Disease or injury takes a greater toll. Local extinctions become common. None of these factors alone has to explain the full severity of the bottleneck. Together they can create a ratchet effect in which each bad year leaves populations slightly less able to survive the next. Recovery stalls, then reverses. A lineage can enter this kind of spiral almost without any single dramatic event announcing it. Volcanic episodes, tectonic disruptions, or other regional disasters have sometimes been invoked in discussions of ancient population crises, but for this particular bottleneck, they remain secondary possibilities rather than leading explanations. There is no strong mainstream case that one singular catastrophe, like a super-eruption, neatly accounts for the demographic narrowing around 900,000 years ago. The timing fits better with prolonged climatic and ecological restructuring than with one brief disaster. Fringe-style explanations tend to promise clean stories because they prefer one cause to many. Deep prehistory rarely rewards that preference. The causes of major demographic collapses are often cumulative, uneven, and difficult to isolate. That may be less satisfying dramatically, but it is more plausible scientifically. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that human behavior itself played a role, not in the sense of blame, but in the sense that the inherited strategies of earlier populations may simply have stopped working under new conditions. A group well adapted to one ecological mosaic may fail when that mosaic shifts. Seasonal routes once efficient may become traps. Preferred prey may become too costly to pursue. Social patterns that function in better connected landscapes may become liabilities when isolation deepens. Human intelligence does not guarantee rapid adaptation to every new pressure. Sometimes a successful strategy becomes maladaptive because the world changes faster than tradition can. If the bottleneck occurred during such a transition, then the crisis may have been partly behavioral as well as environmental. This is where the debate becomes most interesting. Some scholars emphasize climate as the main driver and see demographic collapse as its downstream effect. Others stress that climate alone is too broad a force and that population structure, life history, and geographic fragmentation must have been equally important. Some are cautious about the entire scale of the crash, arguing that structured populations can mimic bottleneck signals genetically, making the event appear more severe than it was in raw head count. These disagreements are real, but they do not cancel the broader picture. Nearly all plausible explanations converge on the same essential point. The human lineage seems to have entered a period in which survival became much harder, continuity much thinner, and recovery uncertain. What makes the crisis so compelling is that it may have been caused by ordinary biological pressures turned relentless. No monster in the dark, no single fallen sky, no mythical punishment, just too little water in the wrong places, too much cold for too long, too few births, too many broken links between groups, too many local disappearances, and not enough resilience left to absorb the losses. That kind of extinction pressure is easy to overlook because it lacks spectacle. Yet it may be the truest form of danger a species can face. Not immediate annihilation, but a long narrowing in which every season is survivable until, somehow, the whole pattern no longer is. So why nearly everyone died may not have one answer, because life at the edge of extinction rarely does. The bottleneck, if real in the strong sense proposed, was likely the product of stacked vulnerabilities. Climate made the world unstable, ecology made it less generous, demography made every setback harder to recover from, social dependence made fragmentation costly, human slowness to reproduce made rebound painfully difficult, and chance, as always, decided which small groups endured one more year and which did not. The result was not simply hardship, but a thinning so profound that later humanity still seems to carry its mark. By the time this process had run its course, the human world may have looked less like a species spread across continents and more like a handful of scattered survivals. Many populations were probably gone forever. Others may have persisted without descendants. A few, somewhere in refuges stable enough to support continuity, remained. To understand those survivors, it is no longer enough to ask what killed the others. It becomes necessary to ask a different question, quieter but more hopeful. In a world broken by cold, drought, and distance, where exactly could humans still live? If the human lineage survived a crisis this severe, then survival did not happen everywhere. It happened somewhere. That simple fact turns the landscape itself into one of the central characters in the story. Near extinction is never only about death, it is also about refuge. A species under broad pressure persists because certain places remain livable longer than others, because some valleys hold water when surrounding ground dries out, because some ecological mosaics stay productive while neighbouring habitats collapse, because topography, climate, vegetation, and chance combine to create pockets where continuity is still possible. For humans around 900,000 years ago, those pockets may have been few, scattered, and fragile, but they mattered more than anything else on Earth. In them, the line endured. Africa is the most likely primary theatre of these refuges, not because it was easy, but because it remained the deepest reservoir of human continuity, even when parts of Eurasia were intermittently occupied. The ancestry leading to later humans is generally thought to have been rooted in African populations. That makes Africa not a single safe homeland, but a patchwork of potential refugial zones. The continent is large, ecologically diverse, and climatically dynamic. Some regions would have become harsher under the shifting Pleistocene climate, but others may have retained enough water, vegetation, and prey stability to support small human groups through long, bad intervals. The challenge is that such refugees leave faint traces. They may preserve a lineage while leaving almost no clear sign that they once carried the future of humanity. One possibility lies in the idea of ecological mosaics. Landscapes where several resource zones overlap closely enough that a mobile foraging population can shift strategies without travelling impossible distances. These are places where woodland edges meet open grassland, where river corridors cut through more arid terrain, where wet season abundance and dry season fallback resources exist within reach of one another. Early humans seem to have done well in such varied environments because they allowed flexibility. If a major prey species moved away, plant foods or smaller game might still remain. If open grassland became less productive, wooded patches might offer shelter, fruit, or different animal communities. In a time of climatic instability, pure environments may fail faster than mixed ones. A refuge, then, may not have been the richest place in good years, but the least catastrophic place in bad years. River valleys and lake margins are obvious candidates, though they were not automatically safe. Water creates life, but it also concentrates danger, competition, and disease. Still, in a drying and fragmenting world, perennial or semi-perennial water sources would have been priceless. A basin with reliable inflow, groundwater-fed wetlands, or sheltered headwaters could support edible plants, attract herbivores, and permit repeated human occupation. Such settings may have functioned as anchors in a shifting landscape. Places returned to again and again because they held enough predictability to matter. The paradox is that some of these ancient refugees may now be among the hardest places to reconstruct clearly. Sediments accumulate, rivers shift course, lake beds dry or erode, and the traces of light human use can vanish under later geological processes. East Africa is often imagined first because of its central role in early human evolution and its complex system of rift basins, lakes, and varied elevations. This is a reasonable focus, but the evidence does not allow easy certainty. Some rift environments may indeed have acted as refuges at particular moments, offering water and ecological diversity when broader regions were under stress. Yet these same basins could also be volatile, with lake levels rising and falling dramatically under climatic swings. A basin that preserves abundant resources in one phase may become inhospitable in another. Scholars still debate how stable such settings truly were over the timescales required by a long bottleneck. What survives in the record suggests opportunity, but also instability. A refuge may therefore have been dynamic rather than fixed, shifting from one region to another as climate patterns changed. Wooded river corridors farther west or in more tropical zones may also have offered resilience, especially where local hydrology buffered broader climatic shifts. Dense forests alone were not necessarily ideal for early humans, adapted in part to more mixed environments. But ecotones where forest met open country could have provided food variety, shelter, and year-round water access. The problem is that tropical environments often preserve very little from such deep time. Bones decay, sites erode, and dense vegetation hides ancient landscapes from easy archaeological detection. Some of the most important refuges in human history may therefore remain nearly invisible precisely because the conditions that sustained life were poor at preserving evidence. This is a humbling thought. The places that save the lineage may be places science can barely see. Southern Africa is another possible refugial region in some broader models of human persistence, though tying specific areas to the bottleneck around 900,000 years ago is difficult. Its environmental diversity, coastal resources in some periods, and topographic complexity have made it important in later human prehistory. But the extent to which those same advantages mattered, This early remains uncertain. Coastal zones in general are attractive as refuges because they can provide stable food inputs when inland systems fail. Yet ancient shorelines from this period are often submerged or transformed beyond easy recognition due to sea level changes. If coastal refugia played any part, much of the evidence may now lie underwater or in landscapes geologically altered beyond straightforward recovery. What defines a refuge is not just resources but continuity. A place can be rich and still not function as a refuge if it is too isolated, too seasonally harsh, or too prone to collapse under the next climatic turn. For a human population to survive through a prolonged bottleneck, it likely needed more than one favourable patch. It needed either a network of connected refuges or at least periodic contact between small groups inhabiting separate ones. This is an important point. A single isolated band can endure for a while, but over long spans, complete isolation is dangerous. Genetic diversity shrinks too far, mate choice narrows, knowledge exchange disappears. So the true geography of survival may have been less like one hidden sanctuary, and more like a broken chain of habitable nodes, connected only intermittently, but enough to keep the lineage from sealing itself inside terminal isolation. Such a network would not have looked impressive from above. No dense population centres, no permanent camps visible year after year, no broad front of human occupation. Instead, there may have been a few valleys, wetland edges, upland pockets with reliable springs, and animal-rich corridors used when climate permitted movement between them. Travel between these nodes would have been risky, and perhaps impossible in some phases, then briefly open in others. During favourable windows, small groups may have met, exchanged mates, shared techniques, or merged temporarily. During harsher intervals, they may have contracted inward again. This pulsing connectivity could help explain how the lineage remained both fragmented and continuous, small enough to register genetically as a severe bottleneck, yet not so completely broken that it vanished. One lesser-known concept in paleoecology is that refuges often do not represent ideal environments in an absolute sense. They represent relative stability compared with the surrounding collapse. A refugium can be marginal, difficult, and poor by ordinary standards, yet still be life-saving because nearby alternatives are worse. This matters because it changes how the survivors should be imagined. They were not necessarily living in lush hidden gardens while the world outside died. They may have been holding on in places that were merely survivable, landscapes that still demanded hard movement, careful resource use, and constant ecological judgment. Refuge does not mean comfort. It means the minimum conditions required for continuity. There is also the possibility that different refuges favoured different adaptive traits. In one region, success might depend on broad diet and mobility. In another, on detailed knowledge of seasonal water and plant foods. In another, perhaps on social networks that allowed intermittent aggregation and mate exchange. If the bottleneck lineage was preserved across several ecological pockets rather than a single zone, then the survivors may have carried a mixed legacy of behaviours shaped by different local pressures. This could help explain why later humanity shows both remarkable flexibility and a strong dependence on cooperation. Survival through refuges may have selected not for one perfect adaptation, but for the capacity to remain workable under several different kinds of scarcity. Eurasian refugees are harder to rule out entirely, but less likely to have been central to the ancestry of modern humans. Some human populations outside Africa may well have survived harsh climatic phases in temperate or subtropical pockets, especially during milder intervals. Yet the broad pattern of a later human evolution still points back toward African continuity. This does not mean Eurasian groups were irrelevant. They may have represented parallel survivals, later dead ends, or branches that contributed to regional human diversity before disappearing. But if the bottleneck refers specifically to the ancestors of all living humans, then the most important refugees were probably African, even if some related populations endured elsewhere. The emotional force of refuges lies in how ordinary they may have been, not legendary lost valleys, not vast untouched Edens, but particular places where water still moved through stone, where edible roots still grew after poor rains, where animals still passed in dry months, where few human families knew enough to return at the right time. The future of humanity may have depended on such places not because they were grand, but because they were dependable. In evolutionary terms, dependability can outweigh abundance. A place that offers moderate resources every year is more valuable than a place of occasional plenty followed by collapse. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is that the survivors themselves would not have known they were in a refuge in the grand sense. To them it was simply where life remained possible. The basin still had water, the corridor still had game, the trees still gave shade, the root still worked, for now. Somewhere beyond those horizons, other human groups may already have vanished. Somewhere farther still, perhaps others endured in similar pockets, never meeting, never knowing that together they form the last fragile web of continuity for the species. That is how extinction often looks from inside, not like a final moment, but like a shrinking world in which only a few places still answer to memory. So the refugees of the survivors were likely not singular and not permanent. They were provisional footholds in a planet that had become difficult to inhabit, linked by movement when possible and isolated when necessary, preserving small populations through sheer ecological stubbornness. In those places, humanity stopped being a broad presence and became a set of holdouts. The line remained alive because some landscapes bent, but did not break. And within those landscapes, survival was not an abstract demographic outcome. It was daily life carried on by very small groups who still had to eat, care for children, avoid danger, remember roots, and trust one another enough to continue. To understand the bottleneck fully, the lens now has to narrow again from the geography of refuge to the intimate human scale of living inside it. Inside those refuges, survival stops looking like a species-level drama and becomes what it always is for human beings, a matter of small groups trying to make tomorrow possible. The broad patterns of climate, ecology, and genetics fade into the background at this scale. What remains are people moving through a hard landscape with limited margin for error, carrying children, reading tracks, judging weather, sharing food when they can, and losing it when they cannot. If the human population really was reduced to a narrow remnant around 900,000 years ago, then life in that remnant would have been marked by an intensity of dependence difficult to overstate. Each group may have contained only a few related adults, some children, perhaps an elder or two, and the fragile thread of accumulated knowledge that made movement through the world more than blind wandering. A species can survive in very low numbers only if its smallest units remain functional. That means the family band, the foraging cluster, the temporary camp becomes the true theatre of human continuity. Such groups were probably not fixed in size year-round. In favourable periods, several small bands may have come together briefly, forming larger social gatherings where food was shared, mates were exchanged, and information passed between people who otherwise spent much of their lives apart. In harder seasons, those same groups may have split again, because too many mouths in one place would strip local resources too quickly. This rhythm of fission and reunion is common in later foraging societies and may have deep roots in human evolution. During a bottleneck, it would have mattered even more. Gathering allowed social and genetic continuity. Splitting allowed ecological survival. The tension between the two may have shaped daily decisions constantly. Stay together too long, and hunger grows. Separate too completely, and connection begins to fail. Food gathering in such a world would have required a different kind of intelligence than modern people often imagine. Not abstract knowledge in the later written sense, but the exact reading of season, terrain, animal behavior, and plant timing. Which valley keeps moisture late into the dry months? Which roots remain edible when surface foods fail? Which herd paths are worth following, and which only waste strength? Which trees fruit irregularly but heavily after certain rains? Which carcasses are too dangerous to contest? Which birds reveal hidden water by their morning flight? None of this would have appeared as science to the people living it, but it was knowledge in the deepest sense tested, social, cumulative, and inseparable from survival. In a small population, the loss of such knowledge was as dangerous as the loss of food itself. Children would have been at the center of this fragile system, both as hope and as burden. Human children are slow to mature, expensive to carry, and dependent for far longer than the young of most animals. That long dependency is one of the foundations of human social life, but during severe ecological stress it becomes a dangerous luxury. A child too young to travel far slows the group. A child weakened by hunger or disease requires attention and transport when energy is already scarce. Yet children are also the only future the population has. The contradiction is brutal. A lineage under demographic pressure must preserve its young precisely when preserving them becomes hardest. This may be one reason human cooperation became so central and perhaps so deeply entrenched. Mothers could not do this alone. A child surviving the bottleneck was likely the work of several people, not one. The role of older individuals may have been even more important than their numbers. In a world without maps, storage, or written memory, elders carried environmental history. They knew where water had lasted in a bad year long ago. They remembered alternate routes, dangerous crossings, and the timing of particular resources. Anthropological work on more recent foragers has repeatedly shown that older adults can contribute crucial ecological knowledge long after physical strength declines. There is no reason to think this principle was absent in the Middle Pleistocene. In fact, it may have mattered more. One surprising possibility is that the survival of tiny human populations depended partly on the preservation of a long-lived memory inside a few experienced individuals. Lose them, and a group might not only grieve, it might lose its map of the world. Mobility itself would have been both solution and danger. To survive changing conditions, humans had to move. Staying in a failing place was a direct path to starvation. But movement costs energy, especially when carrying infants, crude tools, gathered food, and perhaps fire if fire was under control and transportable in some form. Movement also exposes a group to unfamiliar terrain, rival predators, and the risk of arriving too late at a resource already exhausted or absent. The survivors of a bottleneck were therefore not simply nomads in a romantic sense. They were managers of uncertainty, constantly balancing the cost of staying against the cost of leaving. Their skill lay not in movement itself, but in moving at the right time, in the right direction, with enough confidence to commit. Social tension must also have been part of life, though the record cannot show it directly. Scarcity puts pressure on cooperation, food sharing, childcare, mating arrangements, the treatment of injured members, and decisions about when to move all become sharper when there is too little to spare. Human beings depend on social cohesion. But cohesion is not automatic. It has to be maintained, negotiated, and sometimes enforced. In very small groups, unresolved conflict can become existential. There is nowhere else to go without enormous risk. At the same time, harsh conditions may also strengthen bonds because everyone knows that isolation is worse. The emotional life of these people is unrecoverable in detail, but it is difficult to imagine that fear, attachment, grief, irritation, loyalty, and endurance were not already deeply human. The bottleneck did not happen to creatures without inner lives. It happened to beings whose survival likely depended as much on managing one another as on managing the environment. Injury would have been one of the great hidden dangers: a twisted ankle, a deep cut from stone, a broken limb from a fall, an animal wound, a bad infection from something minor by modern standards. Any of these could cascade into fatal consequences in a small foraging band. An injured adult consumes energy without producing much of it. Someone else must slow down to help. Roots become harder. Defense weakens. Yet what survives in later human evolution strongly suggests that care for the injured and infirm has deep roots. Even much later fossil evidence shows individuals surviving serious impairment longer than pure abandonment would allow. If such care existed in some form during the bottleneck, it would have been both costly and profoundly important. It is possible that one of humanity's great strengths was not efficiency alone, but the willingness to bear inefficient burdens for one another. The question of mating networks becomes especially pressing in such a reduced population. A species cannot survive through tiny isolated family groups forever. There must be enough contact between groups to avoid extreme inbreeding and to maintain social as well as genetic exchange. This means that even during the harshest intervals, survivors probably required at least occasional meetings across the wider landscape. These meetings may have been rare, tense, and brief, timed to favourable seasons or predictable resource concentrations. They may have involved exchange not only of mates, but of stone sources, root knowledge, and learned behaviours. In a bottleneck, these encounters would have been some of the most consequential moments in existence, even if they left almost no trace. The future of the lineage may have depended on brief episodes of contact in places where several groups still had reason to converge. Night would have had its own importance. Whether or not fire was consistently under control in all surviving groups, darkness transformed risk. Predators became harder to monitor. Temperature dropped. Injuries and vulnerability felt larger. If fire was available, even intermittently, it would have changed everything: warmth, protection, light, the possibility of social time after sunset, perhaps even the digestibility of food. If fire was absent or unreliable, then nights in the bottleneck world were harsher still. This uncertainty matters because it affects how we imagine resilience. A species surviving near extinction without reliable fire is one kind of miracle. A species surviving with fire but without abundance is another. Scholars still debate the timing and consistency of fire control at this depth, and the evidence remains incomplete. But either way, the bottleneck population lived close to the raw edge of environmental exposure. One of the most revealing features of later humans is the extent to which cooperation seems built into our reproductive and social systems. Humans share food extensively. They teach with unusual intensity. They support dependent offspring through many years. They rely on older individuals for knowledge. They form alliances beyond the immediate mother-child unit. These are not minor traits. They are structural to being human. It is possible that the bottleneck did not create them from nothing, but it may have rewarded them sharply. A small group in a hard refuge survives less by individual brilliance than by distributed competence. One person reads the weather, another remembers a route, another carries the child when the mother weakens, another keeps watch, another shapes tools, another finds fallback foods. In such a system, survival is collective long before it is cultural in the later historical sense. There would also have been loss constant, intimate loss, not the grand loss of vanished civilizations, but the sharper kind, someone who does not return from a foraging trip, someone who sickens after a bad water source, a child who weakens during a poor season, an elder who dies taking root memory with them. In tiny populations, grief and danger would have overlapped almost completely. Every death mattered emotionally because every death also mattered structurally. Later, humanity built rituals, burials, myths, and systems of remembrance. Around 900,000 years ago, whatever forms mourning took were likely simpler and largely invisible to us. But the burden of losing people in a small band is a human constant. It would have pressed on these survivors as heavily as the climate itself. And still, despite all of this, some groups endured. They kept enough children alive. They met other groups often enough. They held on to enough ecological knowledge. They moved when they had to move and stayed when they had to stay. Their tools remained good enough. Their bodies remained fertile enough. Their care for one another remained strong enough. That phrase, strong enough, may be the most accurate way to think about survival here. Nothing suggests abundance. Nothing suggests safety. The bottleneck population did not flourish in any easy sense. It persisted above the line of disappearance by margins so thin that later humanity can barely imagine them. This is perhaps the most important shift in scale the story demands. Near extinction is not only a problem of ice ages and gene frequencies, it is a problem of whether a handful of tired people in a dry landscape can still cooperate after too many bad seasons. Whether they can still carry their children, whether they can still trust remembered routes, whether they can still share enough food to keep the weak alive, whether they can still find one another across distance. Those questions are not dramatic in the way later history often prefers, but they are the real substance of survival. Humanity may have been saved not by any sudden breakthrough, but by countless acts of endurance and social dependence repeated in very small groups that had almost no room left to fail. From this angle, the bottleneck becomes less like a single event and more like a long apprenticeship in living on the edge. And if that is true, then it may have done more than merely preserve the lineage. It may have favoured certain traits within it: flexibility, cooperation, memory, perhaps technological persistence, perhaps fire use, perhaps the social intensity that later becomes one of the defining strengths of our species. The survivors were not simply the last people left. They may also have been the people whose way of living, however modest and improvised, was best suited to a broken world. If a tiny remnant of humanity survived this long crisis, it is reasonable to ask whether survival itself began to shape the species in lasting ways, not through destiny, and not through any simple story in which hardship automatically creates improvement, but through the quieter logic of selection and persistence. A bottleneck does not make a population wiser by moral force. It changes which traits, behaviours, and social arrangements remain represented when recovery begins. In that sense, the near extinction around 900,000 years ago may have been more than a demographic narrowing. It may have been a filter. Whatever forms of behaviour helped humans stay alive in fragmented refuges, under chronic food stress and unstable climate, would not just preserve individuals, they would preserve the line from which all later humans emerged. One of the strongest candidates for such a survival advantage is behavioral flexibility. Earlier humans were already adaptable before the bottleneck, but a severe and prolonged crisis would have rewarded those groups most capable of shifting diet, mobility patterns, and resource use when familiar strategies failed. Flexibility sounds broad, almost vague, until it is translated into real situations. A group accustomed to relying heavily on large herbivores may have had to lean harder on plant foods, tubers, small animals, or scavenging. A seasonal movement route may have needed to change because a former wet season basin no longer filled reliably. Tool use may have become more expedient in one place, more curated in another, depending on how often raw stone sources could be revisited. In such a world, rigid success could become lethal. Survivors were likely not the strongest in any simple sense, but the least trapped by one way of living. This does not mean dramatic technological revolution happened overnight. The archaeological record around this span does not suddenly blaze with unmistakable new inventions. What it more often suggests is continuity under pressure, with some populations maintaining Acheulean traditions and perhaps refining them locally. But continuity itself can be an achievement in a collapsing world. A hand axe that still emerges symmetrical and effective after generations of hardship implies more than tool skill. It implies teaching, practice, and enough social coherence to preserve a demanding tradition. That matters because a bottleneck threatens not only lives, but the transmission of competence. If some populations continued to produce effective large cutting tools, then they were doing something more than simply existing. They were maintaining structured knowledge under demographic strain. This is one reason the controlled use of fire looms so large in any discussion of human resilience. Even though the evidence around this time remains contested, fire, if used reliably, would have transformed survival in ways both obvious and subtle. It offers warmth during cold nights, light after sunset, some protection against predators, and perhaps a center around which social interaction could stabilize. More importantly, it alters food. Cooking can increase digestibility, make some plant foods safer or more useful, soften tough tissues, and reduce chewing time. Over long periods, these changes matter enormously. A population living near nutritional limits gains a powerful advantage if it can extract more calories from the same resources. Yet the evidence for consistent fire control by 900,000 years ago is uneven and still debated. Some sites hint at it, others remain ambiguous. Scholars still argue over whether certain burn traces reflect deliberate human use or natural processes. That uncertainty matters, but so does the possibility itself. Even intermittent fire use could have made a difference. A group that knew how to maintain natural fire once acquired, transport embers, or repeatedly return to places where fire could be preserved, may have had a major edge over one that did not. The important point is not to overstate the evidence, but to recognize that the bottleneck period sits close to one of the most consequential thresholds in human adaptation. Whether or not fire was already under full control, the pressures of this age would have made its benefits enormous. A colder, more unstable world rewards any behavior that extends social time, protects the vulnerable, and improves the energetic return on scarce foods. Beyond tools and fire lies something even more fundamental, the deepening dependence on social intelligence. Human beings do not survive ecological crisis as solitary problem solvers. They survive through cooperation organized across kinship, reciprocity, memory, and shared risk. The bottleneck may therefore have favored groups in which cooperation was not optional ornament but structural necessity. Food sharing, alloparenting, care for the injured, tolerance within the group, and the ability to coordinate movement under uncertainty would all have improved survival odds. This does not mean prehistoric humans became noble in hardship. Social life under scarcity can be tense and costly, but groups that failed to sustain cooperation probably failed to sustain themselves. The line that continued may therefore have been drawn disproportionately from populations whose social systems were especially resilient. This is where cognition enters the story in a less dramatic but more plausible way. The bottleneck need not have produced a sudden leap in brain size or abstract thought visible in one generation. What it may have done is intensify the value of planning, memory, environmental reading, and communication. A group that can remember alternate routes, anticipate seasonal failure, teach young members how to find fallback foods, and coordinate with neighbouring bands has a better chance of persisting through repeated ecological shocks. These are not glamorous innovations in the later symbolic sense, but they are profound. Human cognitive success may owe as much to the repeated demands of surviving uncertainty as to any one spectacular technological breakthrough. Some researchers have speculated that deep demographic events around this time may align with important biological shifts in later human ancestry. Though these arguments remain debated, the idea is not unreasonable. When a population passes through a severe bottleneck, genetic drift becomes stronger, and lineages that survive begin recovery with a narrower inherited base. Over time, this can make certain traits spread more easily through the descendant population than they would in a much larger, more genetically diffuse lineage. But caution is necessary. It is very difficult to tie specific anatomical or cognitive developments directly to one bottleneck event so far back in time. The fossil record is too sparse, the genetic evidence too indirect, and the pathways of evolution too entangled. What can be said more safely is that such a crisis would have altered the population context in which later human traits evolved. One of the more interesting possibilities is that the bottleneck sharpened the importance of cultural resilience. A small group can survive with limited technology if it preserves practical knowledge effectively. In that sense, the decisive trait may not have been a particular tool, but the ability to transmit methods reliably across generations even when adult numbers were low. Teaching, imitation, patience, and prolonged juvenile learning are all hallmarks of humanity in later periods. Their roots likely run deep. Under bottleneck conditions, populations that were better at conserving hard-won knowledge would have been more likely to persist. This is not the same as invention. Invention matters, but in a broken world, preservation may matter even more. The bottleneck may also have amplified dependence on broad diets and ecological opportunism. Later humans become masters of dietary flexibility, capable of exploiting coasts, forests, grasslands, cold steppe, and eventually nearly every terrestrial biome. That immense later plasticity has deep origins. A prolonged crisis around 900,000 years ago could have rewarded precisely those populations willing or able to treat many resources as usable rather than clinging to narrower preferences. Tubers, marrow, insects, opportunistic scavenging, small vertebrates, seasonal fruits, and mixed foraging strategies may all have become more central to survival when larger prey or predictable habitats failed. The human line that emerges from such a filter may have been less specialized and more behaviorally elastic than some of its contemporaries. There is a temptation, when telling stories about near extinction, to search for a single heroic adaptation that saved the species. Fire did it, cooperation did it, better tools did it, intelligence did it. The reality is almost certainly less theatrical and more cumulative. Different populations may have survived for different immediate reasons depending on local ecology. In one refuge, reliable water and route memory may have mattered most. In another, diet breadth. In another, social ties between groups. In another, perhaps fire or technological persistence. No single explanation fully accounts for survival across a fragmented world, but taken together, these factors begin to sketch the kind of population that would be most likely to endure socially cohesive, behaviorally flexible, technically competent enough to preserve useful traditions, and capable of adapting without the protection of abundance. This is also the moment when humanity begins to look less like a creature surviving by body alone, and more like one surviving by accumulated behavior. The body still matters, of course. Endurance walking, efficient thermoregulation, manual dexterity, and generalist anatomy remain crucial, but in a prolonged bottleneck, anatomy can only carry the lineage so far. What matters increasingly is how people use their bodies together, how they distribute labor, how they remember landscapes, how they teach, how they widen the range of edible and exploitable things, how they reduce risk socially when the environment refuses to reduce it for them. If the crisis selected for anything in a broad sense, it may have selected for humanity's tendency to survive as a network of minds, rather than as isolated organisms. That idea also helps explain why later human history, for all its variety, repeatedly returns to certain structural themes: long childhood, heavy parental investment, shared food, skilled tool transmission, cooperation beyond the immediate mother-child pair, dependence on memory, adaptability through culture. These are not inventions of civilization. They are ancient commitments, perhaps made sharper by episodes when populations without them simply vanished. The bottleneck did not create human nature in full, but it may have stripped away some lineages and left standing those in which these traits were especially strong or especially well integrated. And yet humility is still necessary. Scholars continue to debate how severe the bottleneck really was, whether fragmentation explains part of the genetic signal, and how directly any specific adaptive trait can be linked to the crisis. The evidence remains incomplete. There is no fossil scene showing a firelit band becoming the future of humanity by virtue of one decisive innovation. What survives instead is a pattern, a lineage under immense pressure, persisting through behaviors that look increasingly familiar in human terms: cooperative care, technical retention, flexibility, memory. These may not be glamorous answers, but they are powerful ones. So the bottleneck may have done something profound without ever announcing it. It may have narrowed humanity down to populations whose way of living was especially suited to surviving instability. Not perfect populations, not inevitably superior ones, but ones whose balance of social dependence, ecological judgment, and practical knowledge kept them alive when many others disappeared. If that is true, then the near extinction becomes more than a disaster survived. It becomes a shaping pressure. The human line that later expands, diversifies, and eventually fills the planet is not merely the line that happened to remain. It may also be the line tempered by a world in which intelligence had to become usable, cooperation had to become durable, and adaptation had to be constant. By the time the worst of the crisis begins to loosen, the survivors may already carry this legacy. They are still few, still vulnerable, still living in hard landscapes, but the patterns that preserved them are now embedded in the lineage itself. The next great question is how that lineage, once reduced so drastically, begins to grow again. Recovery from a bottleneck is never simple. It takes time, space, fertility, and the return of conditions under which a small population can become something larger, And when that recovery comes, it does not restore the old human world exactly as it was. It creates the foundation for a different one. Recovery does not arrive like rescue. There is no sudden turning point at which the skies clear, the lakes refill, and humanity steps gratefully back from the brink. A population that has been reduced for a very long time does not simply rebound because conditions improve slightly. It has to rebuild itself from thin numbers, scattered groups, limited diversity, and fragile networks. That takes generations beyond counting. It takes children surviving where previously they did not. It takes roots reopening between refuges. It takes ecological stability lasting long enough for confidence to return to movement, mating, and expansion. And even then, recovery does not mean restoration of the older world exactly as it was. A bottleneck changes the lineage that emerges from it. What comes after is not a return. It is a beginning built from survivors. At some point after the deepest constriction, the balance seems to shift. Climatic systems remain unstable in the long Pleistocene sense, but not every interval is equally destructive. Refugees that once functioned mainly as holdouts may begin to act as sources. Corridors that had become unreliable may reopen seasonally or across longer favourable phases. Small groups that had spent generations at the edge of isolation may once again encounter one another more often. The result is not explosive population growth in any modern sense, but a slow thickening of human presence. More births survive, more landscapes become worth revisiting. Knowledge begins to spread again instead of merely being preserved locally. The human line, which had been reduced to narrow continuity, starts to accumulate momentum. This process would have been uneven. Some refugial populations may have expanded while others vanished before they could contribute much. Some routes may have reopened only briefly, creating pulses of contact rather than stable connection. In one region, better rainfall may have restored grasslands and brought back herbivores in numbers worth following. In another, woodland edges may have regained enough productivity to sustain longer residence. Recovery in deep prehistory is rarely universal. It moves through landscapes as opportunity returns in patches. But patchiness does not prevent demographic improvement. In fact, it may structure it. A few productive areas can generate local population increase, and once numbers begin to rise, the possibilities of exchange, learning, and dispersal widen with them. The most important fact about post-bottleneck recovery is that it happened at all. That may sound obvious, since later humans clearly exist. But it is not trivial. Many species pass through demographic crises and never regain their former range or diversity. Small populations can remain trapped in low numbers for long periods, or decline again when the next environmental shock arrives. For the human lineage to recover meaningfully, enough groups must have remained viable long enough to form a broader breeding network. This suggests that the surviving population was never reduced below the absolute threshold of long-term continuity. However close it may have come, that threshold is difficult to define precisely, but the existence of later humanity proves that it was not crossed. The survivors were few, but they were enough. As numbers began to rise, the effects would have extended beyond headcount. Social worlds become more robust when populations are larger and less fragmented. Mate exchange becomes easier. Local knowledge can circulate rather than dying in place. Innovations, even modest ones, have a better chance of spreading. The loss of one group no longer threatens the lineage so directly because other groups remain within range of interaction. This is what real demographic recovery means. Not just more people, but more redundancy, more connectivity, more resilience against bad luck. A species is strongest not when every population thrives equally, but when enough populations exist that local failure no longer resembles species-level danger. The archaeological record may preserve hints of this thickening, though cautiously. Across the broader Middle Pleistocene, human traces become more visible in some regions, and later ancestral populations begin to appear with greater anatomical and geographical complexity. This is not a clean or immediate signature, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the overall impression is that the human story after the deepest constriction is not one of terminal decline. There is continuity, expansion, and eventually diversification. Populations occupy wider territories again. Regional variation becomes more pronounced. The lineage that later gives rise to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens appears to gain clearer form out of the earlier haze. Whatever the bottleneck did, it did not end the experiment of humanity. It narrowed it, and then, slowly, allowed it to spread again. This spreading likely began in Africa, where the surviving ancestral populations were most probably concentrated. As ecological conditions became more favourable in some intervals, those populations may have expanded into surrounding zones that had previously become too risky or unproductive. Expansion at this stage did not require anything like civilization or even dramatic technological novelty. It required slightly better survival odds and the demographic patience of many generations. A few more children reaching adulthood, a few more women reproducing successfully, a few more encounters between bands, a few more routes maintained through memory, over long spans. Such ordinary improvements create extraordinary consequences. Population recovery is one of the quietest major events in prehistory because it is built from repeated successes too small to notice in a single lifetime. There is also a deeper evolutionary consequence here. Once recovery begins, the descendants of the bottleneck population carry forward a narrower ancestral base than the wider pre-crisis human world once held. That means the repopulation of later humanity does not restore lost diversity. It builds outward from what remained. In genetic terms, the recovering lineage is both stronger and more constrained. Stronger because numbers are rising. More constrained because many older lineages are already gone. The future human family tree therefore grows from a reduced trunk. That may be one reason later humanity looks both expansive and oddly unified. It contains immense regional diversity, yet beneath that diversity lies a relatively tight shared ancestry, compared with what might have existed before the bottleneck. As populations expand again, geography begins to matter in new ways. A small and isolated population experiences landscape as a matter of survival thresholds. A growing one begins to experience landscape as opportunity. New valleys become reachable. Seasonal mobility broadens. Raw material sources once too distant become worth the effort. Peripheral habitats can be tested. Some will fail, as they always do. But failure now occurs within a larger demographic context. This is one of the great benefits of recovery. It allows experimentation. A lineage that has escaped immediate extinction pressure can once again afford local risk, because the whole species is no longer hanging from a handful of groups. Expansion becomes possible because continuity has thickened behind it. This may also be the stage at which some major later human branches begin to separate more clearly. The ancestry of Neanderthals and Denisovans, for example, likely emerges from deeper Middle Pleistocene populations after this long period of recovery and restructuring, while the line leading to Homo sapiens continues in Africa. The exact timing and branching pattern remain debated, but the larger point is clear. The human family that later diversifies into several recognizable forms seems to arise after the bottleneck era, not before it in any fully developed sense. That makes the recovery period foundational. It is the demographic and ecological space in which later human diversity becomes possible. One lesser-known implication of recovery is that culture may begin to stabilize differently when populations are larger. In very small populations, even useful skills can be lost by chance. In somewhat larger and more connected populations, cumulative behavior becomes easier to preserve. This does not mean a sudden burst of modernity. It means that traditions have a better chance of surviving the death of one skilled individual or the temporary isolation of one band. Over long periods, this matters enormously. Cultural retention and incremental improvement become more reliable when social networks thicken. A recovering post-bottleneck humanity may therefore have been better able not just to survive, but to accumulate practical refinements in tool-making, habitat use, and social coordination. Yet the shadow of the bottleneck would still have remained. Recovery from a severe constriction does not erase vulnerability. The human lineage continued to face glacial cycles, habitat shifts, and repeated pressures throughout the Pleistocene. Later populations would still disappear. Whole branches of the human family would still be lost. What changed was not that danger vanished, but that the lineage had regained enough depth to endure danger without coming so close to total erasure every time. In that sense, the post-bottleneck world is not safe. It is merely survivable on a larger scale. The emotional weight of this recovery is easy to miss because it leaves no clear celebration in the record. No population knew that the worst demographic danger was passing. No one marked the first generation in which enough children survived to thicken the future. No campfire conversation recorded that old roots had opened again, or that distant kin were once more within reach. But somewhere, slowly, all of this must have happened. The world grew slightly less punitive in enough places for long enough that small human populations stopped merely holding on and began expanding outward again. That shift, though invisible in any one moment, is one of the great turning points in our story. From it comes the later human abundance that deep prehistory had once nearly prevented. Over many hundreds of thousands of years, the descendants of those survivors diversify, adapt, spread, and fill continents in ways no one living through the bottleneck could have imagined. Yet all of that later flourishing remains marked by the narrowness of its origin. Recovery did not create a new humanity from scratch. It unfolded from the remnants of the old one, carrying forward both the strengths that preserved it and the losses that could never be restored. So the population returns, but not as it was before. It returns altered by survival. It returns from refuges into wider landscapes, from isolation into intermittent connection, from fragile continuity into the first stages of resilience. The human line becomes thicker, more geographically expansive, and more capable of sustaining diversity again. But every step of that return is haunted by what preceded it. The broad future of humanity is built atop a long period in which almost nothing about survival could be taken for granted. Recovery is therefore not simply a rebound. It is the moment when the nearly broken chain holds, then slowly begins to lengthen. And once it lengthens, a new reality becomes possible. All later humans, every population, every branch, every eventual civilization will be shaped by descent from that narrowed ancestry. The bottleneck does not remain a passing episode behind them. It becomes part of their biological inheritance. To understand what humanity is after the crisis, it is necessary to ask not only how the population returned, but what kind of species emerges when an entire future has been forced through so small a gate. To descend from a bottleneck is to inherit both survival and loss at the same time. That is the deeper meaning of a species built from survivors. The line continues, yes, but it continues carrying only a fraction of what once existed. Every branch that fails takes with it combinations of genes, behaviors, and possibilities that are never fully restored. The populations that recover afterward do not reassemble the vanished human world. They expand outward from what remained after the narrowing. This is why the bottleneck matters far beyond the drama of near extinction. It may have helped shape the biological character of all later humans by reducing the ancestral pool from which every later population emerged. Humanity today is vast in number and dazzling in variation. Yet under that variation there may lie an older and stranger fact: we're a widespread species, with the inherited signature of having once been very few. One of the clearest consequences of a severe bottleneck is reduced genetic diversity. In simple terms, when fewer individuals contribute to future generations, fewer genetic lineages survive the passage. Some variants disappear entirely by chance. Others become common not because they are especially useful, but because they happen to be carried by those who remain. Over time, mutation adds new variation again, and later population growth creates regional diversity. But the deep loss is never completely undone. This is one reason humans, despite living across nearly every environment on Earth, are genetically less diverse than many other animals with far smaller present-day ranges. Our outward abundance can hide an inward narrowness. The surviving line may have recovered spectacularly in numbers without ever recovering the full range of ancestral variation that existed before the crisis. That narrowness has implications beyond abstract genetics. A reduced ancestral base can shape which biological traits become widespread, which vulnerabilities persist, and how later populations respond to pressure. Not every vulnerability in modern humans should be blamed on a bottleneck nearly 1 million years ago. Of course, later demographic events, selection, drift, disease, migration, and cultural change all matter enormously. Still, a deep bottleneck can leave a species with less raw variation to draw from than it might otherwise have had. Variation is not a luxury in evolution. It is the material from which populations adapt. A lineage that survives through a narrow passage may endure brilliantly afterward, and yet remain marked by the cost of having passed through it. This makes the human story feel both triumphant and constrained. All later expansions into colder latitudes, across deserts, over mountains, into islands, eventually into every part of the globe, were accomplished by descendants of populations that may already have been genetically simplified by deep prehistory. That does not mean weakened in any straightforward sense. In some cases, bottlenecks can streamline a lineage, allowing certain useful traits to spread more easily through a recovering population. But simplification comes at a price. It means there are versions of humanity that once existed and no longer do, biological alternatives erased so early and so completely that the living species can barely imagine them. There's also an evolutionary irony here. Humans often think of themselves as uniquely diverse because the cultural range of our species is extraordinary. Languages, traditions, lifeways, bodies adapted to different climates, social forms, technologies, beliefs taken together. Later humanity appears endlessly varied. Yet much of that diversity unfolds on top of a relatively narrow biological foundation. Culture multiplied where genes had earlier been thinned. In that sense, one could argue that human flexibility became even more important, precisely because the lineage that survived may have had to do more with less. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the balance between biology and culture in our history. But the pattern is striking. A species descended from a bottleneck may become expansive not by preserving every old possibility, but by learning to generate new ones behaviorally. Another consequence of passing through such a narrow gate is that later humanity may share deeper common ancestry than sheer population size today would lead one to expect. Modern humans are obviously not identical, and regional populations have their own histories of selection and adaptation. But compared with many other widespread species, the shared ancestry among humans is remarkably close. This has moral implications in the present, though deep prehistory did not create morality. It simply reveals kinship. If all living people descend from populations that once stood together near the edge of disappearance, then the divisions that later history treats as monumental begin to look recent and superficial against the deeper continuity of the species. Beneath empire, ethnicity, language, and nation lies a common inheritance shaped by ancient scarcity. The bottleneck may also help explain why founder effects and expansions later play such prominent roles in human history. A lineage already marked by one deep constriction can experience additional narrowing events that leave clear regional signatures. Much later, when Homo sapiens expands out of Africa, further founder effects reduce diversity in successive populations moving across the world. These later demographic filters stack on top of older ones. The result is a species whose history is not one of uninterrupted growth from boundless ancestral variety, but of repeated contractions and expansions, each leaving marks in the genome. The 900,000-year crisis, if real in strong form, may have been one of the oldest and most consequential of these filters. What survived from the bottleneck was not only DNA, but a mode of existence. The descendants of the survivors carry forward the behavioral strengths that allowed a tiny lineage to endure cooperation, memory, flexibility, social dependence, and practical intelligence embedded in group life. Those traits do not remain static. They evolve, diversify, and interact with changing ecologies and later human branches. But the post-bottleneck species is, in an important sense, built from populations for whom solitary competence was never enough. Humanity becomes the global animal of shared attention, shared food, shared teaching, and shared vulnerability. If the bottleneck selected for anything at all, it may have selected for the truth that our success depends less on individual dominance than on collective survival. There is something haunting in the idea that every later human achievement rests on such narrow ancestry. The people who eventually cross continents, master fire more completely, hunt huge animals, paint caves, bury their dead, domesticate plants, build cities, and send signals into space all descend from a lineage that may once have been close to demographic failure. The grandeur of later human history does not erase that fact, it amplifies it. Every triumph becomes stranger when measured against the possibility that none of it had to happen. The species built from survivors is not a species destined for greatness. It is a species that got another chance. And chances come with shadows. A population that passes through a deep bottleneck may carry hidden fragilities forward. Some harmful variants can drift to higher frequencies by chance. Some potentially useful diversity may be lost. The species that emerges may be robust in some ways and unusually constrained in others. Modern human health, behavior, and development are far too complex to be traced cleanly back to one ancient event, and it would be misleading to force that connection too far. Yet the general principle remains sound. Evolution works with what survives, not with what would have been ideal. Humanity after the bottleneck may therefore reflect not an optimized design, but a workable inheritance shaped by contingency. This also changes how extinction should be understood in relation to us. People often think extinction is what happened to others: mammoths, saber-toothed cats, vanished human relatives, lost branches that never became us. But if the bottleneck hypothesis is correct, then extinction is not a distant spectacle in our story. It is part of our ancestry. The living human species may be what remains after many alternatives were stripped away. That includes not only non-human species around us, but other possible versions of humanity itself. We're not the full range of what the earlier human family may once have been. We're the residue that continued. The language of residue can sound bleak, but it also contains a different kind of awe. What survives after a great narrowing is often more cohesive precisely because so much else is gone. Later, humanity inherits a strange combination of unity and incompleteness. We are tightly related across enormous distances, yet descended from a deeper world of lost populations and vanished lineages. We are one surviving answer to a larger prehistoric question. That makes the human present feel less permanent and more improbable. It also places the later diversity of our species in a poignant frame. Every face, every language, every tradition alive now unfolds from a lineage once reduced almost beyond recovery. One lesser-known but important consequence of this perspective is how it reshapes the meaning of ancestry itself. Most people imagine ancestry as something that multiplies endlessly backward, an ever-growing crowd of forebears. In one sense, that is true, but bottlenecks force those lines back through narrow channels. However large the apparent web becomes, it repeatedly passes through smaller sets of common ancestors. The farther back one goes into a severe demographic constriction, the more the living world converges. The bottleneck around 900,000 years ago may represent one of the deepest such convergence points in our story. A vast future species narrows there into a surprisingly small ancestral cluster, then expands again. That movement from many possible humans to very few, to many people once more, is the pulse hidden inside our biological history. To say that modern humans are built from survivors is therefore not just poetic. It is literal. Every person alive inherits a lineage that stayed fertile through climatic violence, ecological fragmentation, and demographic peril over spans of time almost impossible to imagine emotionally. That inheritance is not visible in daily life. It does not announce itself in ordinary memory. Yet it is present in the shared architecture of human existence: low overall genetic diversity, deep common ancestry, social dependence, and a species-wide history written not as uninterrupted ascent but as repeated escape from danger. And perhaps that is the most important legacy of the bottleneck. It leaves humanity with no honest basis for imagining itself invulnerable. The species that now transforms entire planets is still, at root, the descendant of populations that once barely held together. Our strengths are real, but they are strengths forged under pressure and carried forward through loss. The same lineage that becomes astonishingly powerful also remains fragile in ways deep history never quite lets us forget. To understand humanity properly is to hold both truths at once. We are expansive, and we come from narrowing. We are diverse, and we descend from reduction. We are everywhere now, and once we were almost nowhere. That inheritance will matter again when the story turns from what the bottleneck did to later humanity toward the question that still unsettles the science itself. How certain is any of this? How much of the near extinction is established? And how much remains interpretation? The species built from survivors is a powerful idea. but it rests on evidence that is still being argued over, tested, and revised. And that debate is part of the story too. For a story, this dramatic certainty remains stubbornly out of reach. That is not a flaw in the science so much as a condition of working this deep in time. The evidence for a bottleneck around 900,000 years ago is provocative, substantial enough to demand attention, and still far from the kind of proof that would close every serious argument. Scholars do not debate it because they are indifferent to the question. They debate it because the stakes are high and the record is difficult. A claim that the ancestors of all living humans nearly went extinct almost 1 million years ago is exactly the kind of claim that must be pressed hard from every side. And when it is pressed, what emerges is not simple acceptance or rejection, but a landscape of unresolved problems that tells us as much about the limits of deep prehistory as about the bottleneck itself. The strongest support for the idea comes from population genetics. Modern human genomes do appear to preserve signals of ancient demographic narrowing, and some recent modelling has placed an especially severe constriction in the range of roughly 900,000 years ago. That is not trivial. These methods are powerful, grounded in established principles of coalescence, mutation, and lineage sorting, and increasingly sophisticated in how they use whole genomes. When multiple genomes from living populations are analysed together, they can reveal broad patterns in ancestral population size that would otherwise remain invisible. This is why the bottleneck hypothesis cannot simply be dismissed as sensationalism. It is built on real science and on a serious effort to explain real features of human genetic diversity. But genetics is only as clean as the assumptions built into its models, and this is where the debate begins. One major criticism is that population structure can mimic the signal of a bottleneck. If ancient humans were spread across many small, semi-isolated groups that exchanged mates only occasionally, the resulting genetic patterns might resemble those of a dramatic population crash, even if the total number of living individuals across all regions was larger than the models imply. In other words, severe fragmentation could look like severe decline from the perspective of later shared ancestry. This does not eliminate the possibility of a real bottleneck. It complicates its interpretation. The genetic signal might reflect fewer ancestors in a strictly breeding sense, without meaning that the world held only a tiny number of human beings alive at any one time. This distinction matters enormously because the phrase near extinction can mislead. It suggests a species on the brink of final disappearance in literal numbers, when the evidence may point instead to a deeply narrowed ancestry pool. Those are related but not identical ideas. A lineage can be perilously restricted in evolutionary terms while still including more scattered living individuals than headlines imply. Scholars who are cautious about the bottleneck often make precisely this point. They do not necessarily deny ancient demographic stress. They question how severe it was, how long it lasted, and whether the most dramatic popular phrasing captures what the models actually show. Another area of uncertainty lies in the fossil record, which, despite all its suggestive silences, does not offer a clear global collapse in visual form. Human remains around this period are sparse, but sparseness is normal in deep prehistory. The absence of fossils from one region or interval may reflect preservation bias, erosion, lack of discovery, or genuinely low population density. It is difficult to convert such patchiness into strong demographic claims without circular reasoning. If one expects a bottleneck, gaps may look like confirmation. If one begins with the limitations of the record, the same gaps may seem less decisive. This is why archaeology and paleoanthropology have not delivered a final verdict. They offer a context that is compatible with the bottleneck, but not a definitive confirmation of it. Chronology adds another complication. Dating events so far back is rarely as precise as public summaries make it sound. Genetic models provide ranges and estimates, not timestamps in the historical sense. Fossil sites are dated through multiple methods, often with error margins that matter. Climatic transitions unfold over long spans rather than one neat moment. The proposed bottleneck overlaps plausibly with the mid-Pleistocene transition, but overlap is not identity. A climate shift lasting hundreds of thousands of years may well create the conditions for demographic crisis. Yet pinning one exact population collapse onto one exact phase remains challenging. Scholars still debate how tightly the timing lines up and whether the strongest demographic signal belongs to one event or to a broader era of repeated stress. There is also disagreement over what kind of human populations were involved. If the ancestors of modern humans were only one branch among several contemporaneous hominin groups, then a severe bottleneck in our lineage need not imply a comparable collapse across all human forms alive at the time. Some researchers find this distinction essential. It allows the genetic evidence to coexist with the continued presence of other hominin populations in parts of Eurasia. But it also means the story becomes harder to tell simply. Humanity almost went extinct may really mean the ancestral branch leading to later Homo sapiens passed through a severe demographic constriction, while other human groups persisted, at least temporarily, outside that line. This is still dramatic, but it is more precise, and precision is what the evidence demands. Some critiques are even more technical. Mutation rates used in deep demographic reconstruction are estimated rather than directly observed over the timescale in question. Small differences in those rates can shift inferred dates significantly. Generation times also matter, and ancient generation lengths are not known with certainty. Natural selection can distort parts of the genome, making neutral demographic inference more difficult if not handled carefully. Different statistical methods can produce somewhat different reconstructions depending on their assumptions and sensitivity to structure, admixture, and recombination. None of this means the science is weak. It means the science is alive. Strong claims are being actively tested rather than passively admired. Even among researchers open to the bottleneck hypothesis, there is often caution about its exact severity. Was the effective breeding population truly as low as some reconstructions suggest? Or does that estimate exaggerate the demographic reality because of population structure? Was the constriction continuous? Or did it consist of repeated downturns separated by partial recoveries? Did it last as long as proposed? Or is the model smoothing over a more complicated sequence of changes? These are not minor details. They shape whether the event should be imagined as a single near extinction, a drawn-out era of low and fragmented populations, or a combination of both. And at present, the evidence remains insufficient to settle all of that cleanly. Yet the existence of debate should not be mistaken for weakness so great that nothing can be said. There are some points that appear increasingly robust. First, the ancestors of living humans almost certainly experienced episodes of strong demographic constriction in the deep past. Second, the period around 900,000 years ago falls within a broader age of climatic and ecological instability, severe enough to make such a constriction plausible. Third, the fossil and archaeological records from this span are sparse enough to be consistent with low population density and fragmentation. The argument is not over whether ancient humans faced danger, it is over how sharply, how specifically, and in what demographic form that danger should be reconstructed. This is where public storytelling often outruns scholarly caution. Popular accounts prefer clarity, Humans nearly died out, then bounced back. Science prefers layered uncertainty. The lineage leading to modern humans may have undergone a severe and prolonged reduction in effective population size during a climatically difficult period, though the magnitude, structure, and exact interpretation remain debated. The second version is less dramatic in wording, but not less astonishing in implication. Even a cautious reading still presents a human past far more precarious than older triumphal narratives allowed. The debates refine the story. They do not empty it. One lesser-known but important part of the debate concerns what future evidence could change the picture. Ancient DNA from this time period is unlikely to be recovered in most African contexts because warm climates destroy genetic material too effectively over such immense spans. That means the gold standard confirmation available for later parts of human evolution may never arrive here. Instead, progress will probably come from better statistical models, richer sampling of modern and ancient genomes from later periods, improved dating, new fossil discoveries, paleo-environmental reconstructions, and closer integration between disciplines. In other words, this mystery may never resolve through one decisive breakthrough. It may instead narrow gradually as separate lines of evidence begin to fit together more tightly. There is something fitting about that. A story centered on scarcity, disappearance, and silence is unlikely to yield all its answers easily. The very nature of the event, if it happened, would have erased much of the evidence one would most like to have. Small populations leave fewer fossils. Fragmented groups leave fewer continuous records. Refugial survival hides in marginal places. Deep time destroys detail. The debate, then, is not a failure of science. It is part of the shape of the evidence itself. Humanity may have passed through one of its darkest demographic passages in a way that almost guaranteed the passage would later be hard to reconstruct. So where does that leave the question not settled, but sharpened? It is reasonable to say that the ancestors of modern humans appear to have endured a major demographic constriction around this period, possibly severe enough to justify the language of near extinction in evolutionary terms. It is also reasonable to say that scholars still debate whether the strongest genetic signal represents an absolute crash, extreme fragmentation, or both. The fossil and archaeological records support a picture of sparsity and instability, but do not force one interpretation. The climate context is compelling, but not uniquely explanatory. In short, the bottleneck is neither proven beyond dispute nor sensational fantasy. It is one of the most serious and fascinating open questions in human deep history, and perhaps that uncertainty adds to the power of the story rather than diminishing it. The human past is not a solved monument. It is a broken trail across a difficult landscape, with footprints missing, weather erased, and only partial signs of who passed where. The bottleneck debate reminds us that even for something as intimate as our own origin, science often works not by recovering a perfect narrative, but by testing competing ways of making sense of damaged evidence. What emerges is not absolute certainty, but disciplined wonder. That wonder matters because the possibility itself changes how later humanity looks, even if the exact numbers are revised, even if the duration is shortened, even if fragmentation explains more than outright collapse. The broad message remains unsettling and profound. Our lineage was not always secure. It lived through periods when continuity was thin, when ancestry narrowed, when the future of the human line depended on a very small and vulnerable set of populations. However the debate is finally resolved, that truth is unlikely to vanish. The species that now fills the planet still carries a past in which survival was much less assured than our present scale makes it seem. And once that is understood, the final step in the story becomes unavoidable. The bottleneck is not just about what happened then. It is about what kind of inheritance that near loss leaves in the human imagination now. The most unsettling part of this story is not the possibility that humanity nearly vanished. It is the possibility that this nearness never really left us. Not in the sense that the same exact bottleneck still governs modern life, and not in the simplistic sense that ancient danger automatically predicts present disaster, but in a deeper sense of inheritance. A species that passes through a narrowing this severe does not merely survive and move on untouched. It carries forward a memory written not in conscious recollection, but in structure, in shared ancestry, reduced diversity, social dependence, and the strange fact that all later human worlds rise from a line that was once almost too thin to continue. The modern planet, crowded and loud and covered in evidence of human power, can make that fragility hard to feel. Yet fragility is one of the oldest things about us. This is not a comfortable lesson, especially because human beings prefer narratives of ascent. They like to imagine history as a ladder from weakness to strength, from confusion to mastery, from small beginnings to rightful dominance. The deeper prehistoric record does not support that kind of confidence. It suggests instead that continuity is often accidental, contingent, and unevenly purchased. Humanity did not earn permanence. Humanity endured because, at some point in a harsh and unstable world, a very small number of populations remained just viable enough for the chain not to break. Everything later, the long expansions, the branching human family, the eventual rise of Homo sapiens, the spread into every continent, the technologies, the empires. The sciences rests on that contingency. Once it is seen clearly, the old story of inevitability becomes difficult to recover. There is a moral humility in this, though morality itself comes much later. A species descended from survivors should be careful about confusing current success with exemption from natural limits. Humans now alter climate, move species, channel rivers, and build environments that seem to buffer them from older ecological pressures. Yet the deep past warns that ecological dependency never disappeared. It only changed form. The early humans of the bottleneck depended on water, prey, seasonal memory, and social coherence at a scale they could directly feel. Modern humans depend on soils, oceans, pollinators, stable climate systems, infrastructure, energy, cooperation across enormous distances, and institutions whose failure can ripple globally. The scale is different. The principle is not. A species that once nearly vanished because its world became harder to inhabit has no reason to assume that abundance has made it invulnerable. At the same time, the bottleneck leaves behind something more hopeful than vulnerability alone. It reveals the oldest strength of humanity, and that strength is not conquest. It is persistence through relation. The line survived not because ancient humans were individually unstoppable, but because they were collectively adaptable. They shared burdens. They preserved knowledge. They kept children alive through bad conditions. They moved when they had to move and held together when fragmentation threatened to turn isolation into extinction. Whatever exact form the bottleneck took, the future of humanity appears to have depended on social survival more than solitary excellence. That may be the most enduring inheritance of all. Human beings are powerful not because they escape dependency, but because they learn to organize it. This casts later history in a different light. Civilizations often present themselves as monuments to control, But beneath every monument is the old human pattern: cooperation under pressure, memory passed forward, food systems managed against uncertainty, the vulnerable kept alive through collective effort. Even the most complex modern systems still echo the older truth that no person and no small group survives long alone. The bottleneck, if it happened in anything like the proposed form, did not merely test the species. It may have exposed what the species fundamentally is, not the animal that dominates by strength alone, but the animal that survives by staying connected long enough for bad eras to pass. There is also a strange poignancy in realizing how many human possibilities are already gone before history begins. If the ancestors of living people pass through such a narrow gate, then much of the earlier human world disappeared without descendants. Whole populations, perhaps whole branches, carried ways of seeing landscapes, solving problems, raising children, and shaping tools that ended with them. Their losses are not commemorated because they happened before writing, before ritual left durable monuments, before anyone could say, in words preserved for others, that something human had been lost. Yet their disappearance shaped the living species as surely as the survival of the remnant did. We are not humanity in its full ancient range. We are one surviving continuity out of many possibilities that the Pleistocene once held. That fact changes the emotional meaning of ancestry. To belong to the human species is not only to inherit a shared line, it is also to stand downstream from a narrowing so severe that the familiar categories of later history become small by comparison. Before there were kingdoms and faiths and borders, before there were even modern humans in the anatomical sense, there was this older and harsher condition in which the continuation of the lineage depended on a few landscapes, a few social networks, a few births surviving where many did not. Every later identity floats above that deeper common ground. The divisions humans build are real in history, but thin in deep time. Beneath them lies a species-wide intimacy forced by ancient scarcity. And yet the bottleneck should not be turned into a simplistic myth of unity either. Shared ancestry does not erase conflict, cruelty, or inequality in later human life. Deep prehistory is not a moral sermon. It is a frame. It reveals scale. It shows that for much of our story, human existence was so precarious that the survival of the lineage depended on conditions far more basic than anything later politics or culture could imagine. That does not solve the problems of the present, but it can strip away some of the arrogance with which the present often regards itself. The species that fills the earth remains, in a profound sense, a recovered species. Recovered species carry scars. Some are visible in genes, some in behavior, some only in the structure of the story itself. Humanity's scar may be this recurring tension between vast success and deep fragility. We spread fast, innovate fast, transform environments rapidly, and yet repeatedly expose ourselves to systemic risk. Perhaps that is simply what any powerful social species does. Or perhaps it reflects something older, a lineage shaped by surviving bottlenecks, one that learned to expand whenever conditions allowed, but never fully escaped the instability that expansion can conceal. Scholars still debate how directly ancient demographic crises connect to modern human tendencies, and the evidence remains incomplete. Still, the resonance is hard to ignore. We are a species with a history of living close to thresholds. To look back nearly 1 million years and see a possible near extinction is therefore to look into a mirror that distorts and clarifies at the same time. The world of those survivors is unimaginably distant. Their bodies are not ours. Their landscapes are not ours. Their dangers are not organized like ours. yet the underlying reality is recognizably human. Small populations depending on knowledge, care, adaptation, and luck. Continuity secured not by certainty, but by keeping enough life together through one more hard season. That is ancient, and it is familiar. Every society since has repeated that pattern in larger and more complex forms. This is why the story matters even if every numerical detail is revised in the future, even if the bottleneck proves less sharp, more fragmented, or differently timed than some current models suggest. The central revelation will remain. The human line was once much more vulnerable than its later achievements imply. It endured long periods when survival was local, contingent, and far from guaranteed. Modern humanity is not the natural default outcome of evolution. It is what happened because extinction did not quite finish its work. That thought carries both gratitude and warning. Gratitude, because every living person descends from an almost impossible continuity maintained through immense spans of uncertainty. Warning, because continuity is never owed. The deep past offers no assurance that a successful species will remain successful forever. It offers only evidence that survival depends on how well a population responds when familiar conditions fail. Ancient humans, in a world of shrinking habitats and broken roots, found ways to remain connected enough to continue. Their inheritance to us is not triumphal certainty. It is a demonstration, repeated across deep time, that life persists by adaptation, cooperation, and attention to limits. So the fragile inheritance of the bottleneck is not simply low genetic diversity or a debated demographic signal in modern DNA. It is a way of understanding what humanity is, a lineage that has already been narrowed once, a species built from remnants, a global population descended from people who lived with almost no room left for error and somehow preserved enough future for the rest of us to exist. That does not make humanity chosen. It makes humanity contingent. And contingency, more than greatness, may be the truest theme of our deep history. When the modern world looks solid, permanent, and overwhelming, the bottleneck whispers another truth. The chain has been thin before. It held. That is extraordinary. But the thinness is part of the inheritance too. To remember that is not to diminish humanity. It is to see it clearly not as the species that could never have been lost, but as the species that was nearly lost and is still here. The memory of that ancient crisis does not survive in words, or in monuments, or in any landscape that still looks the way it did when those small human groups moved across it. The lakes have changed, the grasslands have shifted, the bones are mostly gone. Even the names we use for those people are uncertain, provisional, caught between fragments and debate. And yet something of that world remains, not as a story they told, but as a condition they passed forward. We are here because the line did not fail. It is a strange thing to sit inside the abundance of the present and look back towards such narrowness. Cities glow through the night, aircraft cross oceans in darkness. Billions of people speak, build, argue, remember. The human world seems too large to fit beside the image of a few scattered bands holding on in broken refuges under a difficult sky. But both worlds are the same story, separated only by time. The larger one rises from the smaller one. The noise rises from the silence. The crowded earth rises from a moment when almost all of the future may have rested in a handful of landscapes, and the people who knew how to move through them. Perhaps that is why this episode lingers in the mind more powerfully than many clearer parts of history. It strips everything back. No empire matters here, no border matters, no written name survives. There is only weather, distance, hunger, memory. children, and the stubborn refusal of a lineage to disappear. Survival at that scale is not grand, it is quiet. It lives in repeated acts no one records carrying the week, following a remembered route, sharing food, waiting out a bad season, finding water one more time. The future rarely announces itself when it is being saved. And so the story widens again, slowly, until it reaches the present, not to flatter humanity, but to place it properly in time. We are ancient, but not guaranteed. We are capable, but not exempt. We come from a species that once nearly slipped out of the world and did not. That fact gives the human story a different kind of dignity. Not the dignity of destiny, but the dignity of persistence. Somewhere in that vanished Pleistocene landscape, long after the cold set in and the old range had thinned, there were still a few people walking forward. They did not know what would follow them. They did not know that every future city, every language, every family line, every remembered name depended on continuity they could never see. They only knew the ground beneath them, the season around them, and the need to keep going.